Good evening. Everybody got a comfortable seat? We have a really good program tonight, and this is the Friends of the Mizzou Botanic Garden Jacqueline K. Jones Lecture Series. And the interesting thing is the last public gathering that was held in this very auditorium was also Friends of the Mizzou Botanic Garden, and that was March 5th, 2020. So we're the first. We were the last, and now we're going to be the first public gathering in this lecture hall. I'd like to welcome you all to the Christopher Bond Life Sciences Center. We're in the Monsanto Auditorium at the University of Missouri, and on behalf of our campus, I'd like to welcome you to Mizzou. Jacqueline Jones was our Vice Chancellor several years ago. She's retired. And one thing I could guarantee that the Jones family was big on was education. And that's why we named our lecture series after Jackie Jones, is because of the emphasis on education. And it wasn't just because her mom, Creola, taught every grade from K through graduate school, but because the Jones family believed in education for everybody, continuing education. I'd also like to recognize some of our friends who have supported Mizzou Botanic Garden throughout the years, and they've done this rather selflessly. Two of them passed away this past year, neither one from COVID, which was better than expected, but still nonetheless, Jim and Franny Joy were great supporters of Mizzou Botanic Garden and kind of the silent folks in the background. Out in the lobby, we have a display of landscape services employees in a photo essay by a PhD student named Corey McNeil. The interesting thing about Corey, when he showed up in my office about 5 months ago, just out of the blue, is that he is a 20-year Army veteran, and he is going back to school to get his PhD in journalism. So that's really just a convergence of things, and especially the work that he's doing with the pictures is amazing. So tonight we have Noah Strycker, and he's going to talk a little bit about his Birding Without Borders. And I am not a bird person, I will tell you that, but I do know that there is a connection between the plants that we choose to plant and the wildlife that we have inhabit our gardens and our forests and everything else that we have in the state of Missouri. And the number one thing that we can plant are oak trees. And if you ask Michael Durr, who is a plant taxonomist of note, he will tell you oak trees. If you ask Doug Tallamy, who's an entomologist and who's studied this, he will tell you plant oak trees. So here in Missouri, that seems like an easy proposition, plant oak trees. We also have the Conservation Department's Sarah Kendrick, who will discuss her work she was doing with Assistant Professor Thomas Bonnet to reintroduce the brown-headed nuthatch to Missouri. I'm not a native Missourian, but I have adopted the gray nuthatch as my favorite bird since moving here. And I'm interested to hear about the brown nuthatch. I'm really taken by the gray, so I want to hear what's the difference between the brown and the gray. We also have local birder Pete Monisel, the other Pete M, which is terrific. I've met the other Pete M, who's going to do an introduction to eBird, a shared public online database of bird observations. And following the presentations, if you could hold on to your questions, we're going to have everybody up here, and you'll get to ask away, and we'll have microphones, and it'll be a little more organized, but we'll have all the questions at the end of the presentations. And Noah will sign some more books here in the auditorium. I think we haven't worn out your, you don't have writer's cramp. Okay, good. Okay, but before we get started, we have to conduct a little bit of business because this is the annual meeting of the Friends of the Mizzou Botanic Garden. The campus is a botanic garden. It's an internationally recognized botanic garden, and it has been since August 26, 1999. And every year we have to do a little bit of business before we get to the Jackie's lecture. So the first order of business is the election of a president, and this is going to be very important because we're working on a strategic plan for the Mizzou Botanic Garden, And this new president is going to get to enact all these wonderful things that we line out. So, is there a nomination?
I would like to nominate Donna Paleo, our incumbent president, to run a second term.
Okay, a second? Cheryl? Second? Okay. All in favor of re-electing Donna Paleo as president, raise your hand, say. Okay. Donna's not here tonight, so that's great. I'll remind her that her term continues. Several ways that you can keep up with the Mizzou Botanic Garden and the Friends. If you want to receive our free newsletter, we publish it 3 times a year. Just sign up out in front at our table. There's also a raffle for some gift cards from Songbird Station. Thank you very much for donating those. And there's also a Mizzou Botanic Garden gift basket out there that does have a signed copy of Birding Without Borders. So if you haven't got a copy, there's one out there already signed. You won't have to stand in line if you win it. You can also visit our website, gardens.missouri.edu, or visit our Facebook page, Mizzou Botanic Garden, or become a supporter and member online. There's brochures out in the lobby at our table, and also there is a donation box out there that if you want to help defray these type of events in the future, that's a great way to do it. Okay, we're done with the business part. So Sarah Kendrick is our first guest tonight. She is with the Missouri Department of Conservation State. She is the state ornithologist. Sarah is a Missouri native who earned her undergraduate master's degrees from MU. Great. MIZ. She has worked to coordinate state conservation partners' efforts for the Missouri Bird Conservation Plan that promotes endangered bird species, habitat management for public and private land managers. She also coordinates bird monitoring on Missouri's priority lands and acts as MDC's contact on bird topics and issues. Additionally, Sarah serves on national and international committees to address threats to migratory birds and works to inspire action in people like all of us to learn more about how they can help declining bird populations. You know, no pun intended, but birds in the environment are literally the canary in the coal mine, and they will tell you if you have a healthy environment or you don't. No birds, you've got problems. Tonight, Sarah will discuss her work on a research project she is conducting with MU Assistant Professor Thomas Bonnet, whose research emphasis is wildlife and landscape ecology with a focus on conservation and adaptation of species and landscapes to climate change and other threats. Tom is also with us in the audience tonight, Dr. Bonnet, and will join the panel later. So if you have questions for Dr. Bonnet, he will be up here with the others. Their project is aimed at reintroducing the brown-headed nuthatch back into Missouri after a 100-year absence. Please welcome Sarah Kendrick.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Is that good? Man, it's really bizarre to talk to actual human beings in person after about a year and a half. This is the first time I've given an in-person presentation in a year and a half. So it's amazing to see all your faces and be here in the room with you. I'm gonna start my watch so I don't go over time. So thanks everybody for coming out tonight. I'm very excited to talk about this topic. It's been one of the funnest projects I think I've ever worked on, which is saying a lot because I get to work on a lot of cool things as your state ornithologist. As Pete said, I'm from Missouri. I went to Mizzou. Hi, John. I went to Mizzou for my undergrad and my master's. And so Mizzou is very near and dear to my heart, and so it's just been really fun to work with people like Tom. I got to work with my thesis advisor, Frank Thompson, on this project as a professional after graduating, so that was really fun too. So I'm happy to be here, and thanks to the Mizzou Botanic Garden for your invitation. So a little bit of background on this project. Bringing back the brown-headed nuthatch to Missouri has been a topic that's about a decade in the making. Conservation partners have been discussing this topic and this idea for a long, long time. And we really, right up front, I want to recognize that we couldn't have done it literally without any of these people listed on the screen. Lots of organizations, Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, that's their state fish and wildlife agency, like the Missouri Department of Conservation, which I work for. Tall Timbers Research Station in Florida, they're kind of an unsuspecting partner. They've worked with nuthatches down there for over 12 years, so we really relied on them for their information. We relied on others for permitting. We needed the Mark Twain National Forest and Washita National Forest because that's where we took birds from and brought them to. So really, we couldn't have done it without any of the people on this screen. But first off, we were kind of the lead team, myself and Frank and Tom, thinking of this project, thinking of the analyses that needed to be done to determine if the project was feasible. So I want to recognize all of them up front. We hired Kristen Heath Aker, who's an incredible person. We hired her to help with the brown-headed nuthatch project. And then Amanda, who is an hourly with the Conservation Department working on the nuthatch project as well. So I really can't say enough about how lucky I've been on this project to work with such awesome and fun people. So communication, clearly with all of these people we needed, was key in this effort. So a little bit about this amazing bird. So the brown-headed nuthatch is a small songbird that is a pine woodland obligate. It means it needs pine woodland for its habitat. So woodland is a little bit different than closed forest, and I'll cover that here in a minute. But they need pine woodland. So you can see this is an abundance map from eBird, which Pete will talk about later, that shows pretty much their range and where they are more and less abundant, mostly the southeastern states in pine woodland. They're a resident bird. They're non-migratory, so they don't make huge dispersals. They pretty much stay in one location and they're there year-round. They're a cooperative breeder, which means that sometimes second-year males will stay and help the parents the following year with nest excavation and brood rearing. These birds are common and widespread in their range. They're not on any threatened or endangered lists. And they sound like a rubber ducky. This is their call. They sound like a rubber ducky. I tell people they sound like a rubber ducky, and people think I'm nuts. And then you play it, and they say, it actually does sound like a rubber ducky. And I'm like, what do you think I'm talking about? Not making it up, I promise. So they do sound like a rubber ducky. You all have evidence now. So habitat requirements of this bird. They require an open understory. They require woodland, which again, we'll talk about here in a moment. They require mature pines for foraging. So they forage up in the cones. They eat the seeds and insects in the cones. And then they need pine snags for nesting. These little guys excavate their own nesting cavities almost every single year. They will also use human-made nest boxes where they're more abundant. But yes, they excavate their own nests. So secondary cavity nesters will use the cavities that they create, like chickadees and titmice and other species like that. So this bird had the official status of extirpated in the state, which means they used to occur here and they don't anymore. So we do have a few historic records of the birds occurring here in the state from the late 1800s and early 1900s. But around this time, our Missouri Ozarks were pretty much being denuded. So shortleaf pine oak woodland systems once covered over 6 million acres in our Missouri Ozarks. This is pine. Shortleaf pine is the only native pine here in the state, and we used to have a lot of it in the Ozarks. But around this time, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, massive logging efforts removed almost all of the timber across our Ozarks, which if you spent time down there, it's kind of hard to believe because a lot of it has come back. But it used to be pine, and when the forest regenerated, it regenerated in oak and hickory. Oak and hickory trees replaced the pine, so we lost a lot of that habitat, and so we may have lost the bird in the early 1900s when these large last swaths of pine were removed. So you can see here in these historic photos from the Ozark National Scenic Riverways, these are from Missouri, from our Ozarks, and you see the big logs on the horse-drawn cart here. All of these logs are pine, and then you look back on the horizon, it's all pine. So there's a lot of pine in the Ozarks before it was all removed, and then it came back as something else. This is a map. This is the historic range of shortleaf pine in black in the outline. So that shows its historic range, and then the red is its current range, or current as of 2012 when the map was made. This is not pine woodland, this is just shortleaf pine, so it requires that management, typically tree thinning to open up the canopy, and prescribed fire every few years to maintain that open structure. So why did partners start talking about this 10 years ago? Well, that's about the time when the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Project, or the worst acronym ever, the CFLRP, was created. The CFLRP is a nationwide Forest Service grant program, and Forest Service districts, like the Mark Twain National Forest, can apply for funding to do landscape scale management. So they did that. They applied for, our project is called the Pine Oak Woodlands Restoration Project. So we got the grant, and the Mark Twain National Forest was able to dump millions of dollars into the management of pine woodland, which means lots of contracts to open that canopy and do prescribed fire. So there's a lot more habitat than there was before, and they've restored pine woodland to a point where people can consider bringing back the brown-headed nuthatch. They are reapplying for funding, and that looks very promising. So brown-headed nuthatches, again, are a resident bird. They're non-migratory. They make few long-distance dispersals. We're about 200 miles from their established breeding populations right now, which are in Arkansas, are the closest ones. We're about 200 miles from them. So the natural recolonization of our big patches of pine woodland we've created up here in Missouri is pretty unlikely. So this is the structure. This is in the Mark Twain National Forest. These are some of the locations where we released birds. So you can see this is a woodland. It has openings in the canopy. When that light comes through the canopy and is able to reach the woodland floor, this rich vegetative layer of shrubs, forbs, and grasses all grow, and that creates shrub nesting habitat for a broader suite of species than just species who will nest up in the canopy. And so woodland is incredible for bird diversity, and it's incredible for a lot of our declining birds here in the state. Because there's just a lot more nesting substrate and more diversity. This is another picture of some of the areas where we released the birds down in the Mark Twain. It's just beautiful. If you guys are down in this part of the world, go to Fremont, Missouri, and look for these locations on the Mark Twain. It's not hard to find because it's just a really beautiful system. So there have been reintroductions of brown-headed nuthatches before in Florida from parts of Florida to other previously extirpated parts of the state. And so they've moved birds in the late 90s, in the 20-teens, and they found positive growth rates, good survival, pairing, and nesting. So we kind of had some baseline information, though a lot fewer numbers of birds were moved. We had baseline information that they would do okay with translocation. So a little bit of background here. There has been some really good research showing the response of shortleaf pine with management to climate change. So here at the University of Missouri and the U.S. Forest Service simulated harvest of these locations in the CFLRP, remember, Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Project study area where they're doing pine woodland. They looked at that area of the state and they simulated tree harvest, the opening up of woodland, and prescribed fire under varying climate change scenarios 100 years into the future. So they can do that with computer modeling to help inform how we manage the landscape at a landscape scale over time to help inform how the landscape will react that far into the future. It's very important for conservation that we plan these things ahead of time to see what will happen. So with management, these models showed that shortleaf pine becomes the most dominant tree species in this part of the state under varying climate scenarios. And so that gave us good support that habitat for nuthatches would continue into the future because it selected for shortleaf pine, but it needs that management. So even though we anecdotally talking to staff down in the Arkansas National Forest, and we felt that we had enough shortleaf pine up here in the state, that's clearly not good enough. We have to do analyses to make sure that the numbers make sense, to make sure that this reintroduction would be feasible. So we had two main questions. They're pretty basic ones. Are Arkansas source populations stable or stable enough to support a removal of a rather small population of birds? We were thinking about 100 birds. And does Missouri have the suitable pine woodland that they need to do well? So Tom Bono here, who will be up for our panel discussion, and Liz Matzer in 2017, they looked at a long-term data set of bird point counts in national forests in Region 8, which Region 8 is the southeast. So all of these dark gray parts are national forests. So they had done an analysis using these bird point counts across all these national forests, so they already had those data. And what they did is they looked at the Ozark-St. Francis National Forest up here and the Ouachita National Forest down here. They lifted all of the points where brown-headed nuthatches were detected. Each of these bird point counts were paired with vegetation data, so we knew what vegetation, what structure, what size trees, what was around the point. So naturally, if you pull up the points where brown-headed nuthatches were detected, you can also look at the habitat that's around it to set up a habitat model to look at what they may be selecting for. So the variables that were related to brown-headed nuthatch abundance in that model were Basal area of pines. Basal area is pretty much kind of a measure of tree density and size. So as basal area of pines increased, so did the abundance of brown-headed nuthatches. Brown-headed nuthatch abundance was the greatest at mid-level canopy covers, about 60% canopy cover. So again, that's not surprising to us. They need that open woodland structure. They need about 2 snags per hectare. That's where their abundance kind of starts to level out. So they need snags. Again, not surprising. They need it for nesting. And then their abundance was greater at lower mid-story canopy cover, which just means the understory underneath the taller canopy. So again, they need that open structure. So then we applied these variables that nuthatches seemed to be using at the points where they were detected in Arkansas. We looked at remote sensing data or satellite collected data of Missouri habitat to compare. Well, if they like that down in Arkansas, how much of that do we have up here in Missouri to create a habitat suitability model? The darker the blue, the more suitable the habitat is for nuthatches. So we do. We have suitable habitat in the CFLRP study area that you see here outlined in black. So they compared pretty well to that model. So then Tom and his team wanted to look at how the trends looked for the brown-headed nuthatch in these national forests. So we see a 6.5% annual growth in the Ouachita National Forest down here in red annually. So that's good annual growth. The Ozark St. Francis National Forest, unfortunately, we didn't have enough detections to model that, but at least the detections, or I'm sorry, at least the numbers are holding steady there and not declining. So this kind of gave us an idea that the Ouachita National Forest is more stable and increasing population, and that taking birds from there may be a better bet. So we sat on that. But that wasn't good enough for us. We wanted a density estimate of how many brown-headed nuthatches there were across the entire Ouachita National Forest and get an estimate of that before we felt confident to move forward with that. So a group of 6 of us went down to sample nuthatches in mid-March of 2019. Now this is another piece of this, is that most breeding bird surveys, surveys conducted at those point counts we talked about, that long-term data set, are conducted in late May and early June. Well, brown-headed nuthatches are almost done. They're either still actively nesting or they're almost done nesting. So they're less detectable. They're not as talkative. They're very quiet during breeding seasons. And so there may have been fewer birds detected during that time when normal bird surveys occur. So we went down there early, pre-breeding, in mid-March. We took 6 people down there. We did 362 point counts for these birds over 3 days. So we had pretty poor weather conditions, but we still got enough detections to model it. So this is the land bird model. This is the habitat suitability model that was based off of the long-term data set that Tom pulled the data from. And then we built a validation model using the data that we went down to Arkansas to collect in March, doing the bird point counts. And it bumped up our density estimates, you see darker blue over here, by 25 to 50%. So that gave us a density estimate, so we were able to loosely estimate the number of birds in the Ouachita National Forest. I promise we will get to photos here in a moment. I just have to tell you the data-y stuff first so that you know that we were legit in all of this. So we estimated the abundance of brown-headed nuthatches in the Ouachita. With our land bird model that we originally had from that long-term data set, we estimated about 8,700 birds. With the data incorporated that we collected down there, we had an estimate of about 21,000 birds. And so it's likely somewhere in the middle, around 10,000 birds, just to be modest. And so we thought that that was stable enough to remove about 100 birds from. That's a lot of brown-headed nuthatches. So then we had all those data, and we brought all those partners you saw at the beginning slide all together to have a big meeting, present all this information, and say, should we or shouldn't we? Should we move forward with the brown-headed nuthatch reintro or not? And all of these partners were super excited, and everybody said, yes, let's go. So then we started planning in the middle of a pandemic for how to do a reintroduction with like 6 to 10 people. How do we do all of this with very small groups, with everybody masked? How do we do this to stay safe? So that added some fun challenges. So I want to talk really briefly before I get to the pretty pictures about our motivations for why we would reintroduce this bird. One is habitat restoration. So as we talked about, there's a lot of support for shortleaf pine restoration in this part of the world. This is really the only part of the state where shortleaf pine occurs. It's kind of a unique system here in Missouri because it only occurs down there in our Ozarks. There's a lot of funding and money and support going towards this system's restoration, and that will continue, so there's support for that. So that helps us. Oh, go back. Also, the major tree species and habitat is supported with varying climate scenarios into the future. So that gives us support for that habitat in the long term moving forward. Also, ecosystem restoration. So when we talk about shortleaf pine woodland restoration, we don't just want to talk about the habitat, the woodland, the tree structure, the habitat structure in general, but ecosystem restoration also means bringing back some of the species we may have lost along the way that left because of things that we did, right, of us removing that habitat. We've restored the ecosystem, and this is just one piece of that. And the bird was extirpated, but that's not the sole reason that we're bringing the bird back. There are other extirpated species that it doesn't make sense that we would just bring them back. This is why we did our due diligence and tried to do the analysis first before we made any movement forward on actually bringing the bird back, because we wanted to be extra, double, triple sure that the birds would, that we felt the birds would do well. Okay, yay, pretty pictures. Are you excited? No more graphs, I promise. Okay, so our reintroduction plan was to move 100 birds over 2 years in August of 2020 and 2021. We would move them from the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas to the Mark Twain National Forest. So capture, this is the fun stuff. Okay, how do we capture these birds? We've seen the map. So we used elevated mist nets. So mist netting is kind of the general way that you capture birds to ban them or to handle them or anything like that. So it's just a lightweight net that you really can't see in this photograph because that's the point. It's lightweight netting that you put up between 2 poles. The bird flies in, falls into one of the trammels in a little pocket, and then you extract the bird, and then you're able to handle it and put bands on it, take measurements and things like that. So we had elevated mist nets, which means we put them on painter's poles so we could put them up. These birds hang out 70, 80 feet up in the canopy, way up high in the cones, remember? So we have to find a way to bring them down out of that canopy into the net. We moved 102 birds, 46 last year and 56 this year. We used conspecific playback, which just means that we put a brown-headed nuthatch squeaky call on a loop and played it under the net so that the birds come down from the canopy. They want to know what's going on and if there are other birds in their territory and check it out, get closer to the net, and hopefully get caught. We also had decoys, which you see here, attached to a stick or a snag or anything nearby to maybe make the birds think, oh, look, there's the bird. I'm going to go close and then hopefully get caught in the net. And then we had Napadal Pathong, which is, he's one of the most amazing photographers. We are incredibly lucky to have him in the state, and he works for the Conservation Department. He takes probably the most beautiful pictures in our Conservationist magazine, and he came down to Arkansas. He broke his quarantine to come down and help us and take pictures. Thank God, because he got to capture this picture of my scared as hell face after 3 years of planning this thing, and we finally opened nets and where the birds are on the trunk right by the net and they won't go in the net. And this is what I look like when I'm freaking out, apparently. So we got that great picture. And then, but we did catch birds, and this is us extracting birds. This is Frank, my thesis advisor. So it was just really fun to work with him on it too. Extracted the birds, and then we put them into 4-inch cardboard mailing tubes. We spared no expense. So we ordered 4-inch cardboard mailing tubes, and one of our best family friends, Matt and Kathy, Matt Knowlton, who's in the back of this room, drilled all of the holes in all of our mailing tubes because I was so overwhelmed and busy. So bless your heart, you're the best. So he drilled holes in all of the cardboard. We put netting on top and put a rubber band on top. So it was very basic, but we saved a lot of money and it worked just fine. So we put 5 live mealworms in each tube with the birds. Some of these we were catching right off the roost first thing in the morning, and so we didn't want them to be hungry during transport. The birds were flown north to Missouri from small regional airports using a small MDC aircraft. It was very small. It was very small, but it was a big adventure. Anyway, using the aircraft really helped us. It cut transport time about in half, so the birds were taken from nets and released in Missouri like 4 to 5 hours after capture, which may seem like a long time, but it's really not. The drive time from these capture sites is about 7-8 hours, so with stops, it just would have, we were just very nervous. This is really the first of its kind moving birds this small over such long distances, so we wanted to be very conservative and make sure we got them there as quickly as possible, and we didn't have any issues. This is a bird we took out of the tube, and we interrupted his snacking. So we do know that the birds, we counted the mealworms to see if they did eat the mealworms on the flight, and many of them did. There's a white slide, I guess. This is a picture of a bird through the netting while we were up in the air on the aircraft on the very first morning. So that's just taking a picture. We put a 1/4-inch dowel through the bottom for a perch. We really did spare no expense with this. Nothing but the best for our nuthatches. And then this is a little video of the birds sitting in the tube while we were up in the air. So we had no signs of stress during transport, trapping, or release. These birds just seem to be very hardy birds. They're just hanging out on the perch, just looking around. So it didn't seem to bother them at all. So at release, we attached an aluminum federal band to one leg, and on the other leg, we attached a unique color combination of plastic bands, which you can see one here. This is to help us re-sight the birds later so that we know that individual had an orange band on right and a federal band on left. So you keep track of them there. That's kind of their unique code. We aged the birds by pulling a few of the ventral, the breast feathers. These birds are not sexually dimorphic. They look the same, and so we have to send the feathers off to a lab to get DNA sexing done to figure out the sex ratio. The first year we had 18 females and 27 males without knowing which sexes we were capturing, so pretty even sex ratio. It's pretty shocking. And then this year's, the sex ratio was almost exactly the same as last year, which is kind of really cool. We attached radio transmitters to half the birds to look at survival. The tags lasted about a month. The battery on them lasted about a month, so we were able to track them around the landscape. And we also placed 30 roost boxes in the release habitat so that the birds didn't have to excavate roosts over the winter, but that was months away, so they would have had time to do that as well. This is a little radio tag you see. We put a piece of paper under it because we're fitting each one to the bird, and then we super glue the elastic onto the tag right here, and so the paper is slipped under the feathers so we don't get super glue on their feathers. These are just other fun pictures of holding nuthatches and being super happy and putting bands on. There's more color bands. We had to cut the color bands smaller because their tarsi are very short, so you can't fit a federal band with a color band. And so we had to keep the colors on one side. These are a few pictures of the radio tags with the antenna hanging down. And this is that big old wedge bill that they excavate their cavities with, and their huge back toe. They're just really cool birds. This is our girl squad right here processing birds before release. This is Frank releasing one of our birds on the first morning, and then this is just that gorgeous pine woodland habitat that's down there in the Ozarks where we were releasing birds. Then we had radio tagged half the birds, so we followed them around all this brushy, scrubby habitat the first year in the rain. The first year we thought we were doing awesome in 2020. We'd brought about 20 birds in 3 days. We were feeling great. We're like, oh, it'll just take another 3 days. And then, as you may recall, 2 hurricanes worth of weather came up the middle of the Midwest and shut us down. So we couldn't fly, we couldn't do anything in big gusty winds or in rainstorms. And so we did a lot of tracking of those first birds that we released, because what else could we do except wait for openings in the weather? And then we're doing re-sighting surveys every single month. We've been down there every month since release, and we are going to do that again for a calendar year after we release them this year. Actually, we got the idea from birders that were down there trying to find the brown-headed nuthatch to get really high-quality cameras to zoom in to see the color bands. So as you can imagine on re-sighting surveys, it's really hard when this bird is 70 feet up, flitting all over the place to get the colors on the legs. We're getting a lot better at it, but it's very challenging. So we're in 2-person teams. One person has binoculars on the birds, and they're more easily able to follow the birds around and maybe get some of the colors. And then there's another person with one of our Nikon cameras just laying on the shutter on every bird they can get at. And then it helps us later when we look closer and zoom in on the pictures to get the color band combinations. So it really helps us to verify these color bands up close. Like this picture where, yes, there's 3 nuthatches in a picture, which never happens, by the way. This is like the best case scenario of a photo because we got 3 in one photo. And it doesn't look like much, but when you zoom in, you can see the color bands. We have yellow, blue on left, yellow, white on left, and then green, green. So if you zoom in, technology's crazy these days. And this one, you might say, well, there's not even a bird in there. Well, there is. He's back here behind a branch. He, she is back here behind a branch. And when you zoom in, you can get the colors, which is red, green. So you just take a ton of pictures, and there's a lot of tedious going through all the photos and zooming in and out. So this was our release site the first year. This is the Mark Twain National Forest in the light green. This is where we released them down here south of Fremont, Missouri. The white star is our release site the first year in 2020. This is just a basic kernel density estimate map showing like kind of a heat map where the darker the red, the more detections of the birds we have using the tracking with their tags. So you can see they did make some long distance movements over to patches of shortleaf pine over here. And then the second year, we decided to do a second release site as well to kind of spread their distribution across to more pine woodland that was available over to the east. So this was the second year. We released half the birds on the old site that we released in 2020, and then half the birds over here. And we had really great distribution and exploratory movements up to 5 kilometers away, which is pretty basic, and some of the largest movements that's pretty common for nuthatches to disperse to. Then they nested. We didn't break them, everybody. They actually nested. They paired up, excavated nests, and they laid eggs and had babies. So this is from March to May of 2021. We monitored the first year's groups of birds nesting. We had 6 active nests found in the locations where we were searching. We installed predator guards on the nest snags, which was pretty much just literally aluminum foil wrapped around the tree with aluminum tape to keep snakes from crawling up to the cavity. We also used pepper spray, sprayed around the bottom to deter mammalian predators. And 2 nest cavities abandoned for unknown reasons. We're not sure why. The female may have been predated or left and abandoned. But we did have 4 successful nests. So we have about 20 to 24 Missouri fledged nuthatches, potentially for the first time in over 100 years. So it's very exciting. This is what one of the nest snags looked like, really decayed, snapped off pine. This is Kristen using an endoscope. We used an endoscope to do nest checks to look into the cavities to see what was inside during our nest monitoring. And we got images like this. Here are 5 eggs. And oh, I forgot to move the picture over. That's awful. Anyway, these are naked nestlings. You can actually see nestlings if I'd move the photo over. And then it also takes videos. So this is a video of me walking up to, or of Kristen walking up to the snag, and you can see the little babies begging in the cavity, and you can count them and then just keep track of how many young each nest cavity has. This is another one of me walking up to the snag, about to poke the camera into the hole, and we have big nestlings. So they look a lot like their parents, don't they, plumage-wise? So these guys were about to pop. They fledged the very next day. But they're very cute. That's my scientific opinion, is that they're very cute. And then we were starting to see birds with their parents. These are fledged birds in Missouri. And you can tell that by any bird that doesn't have bands on it has been fledged here in the state. So that's kind of cool moving forward to monitor that. So again, that kind of wraps up my portion of this. We had so many partners that were just really invaluable to this. This is the group from Tall Timbers Research Station in Florida. They traveled 12.5 hours during a pandemic. They had to quarantine weeks before and after. They came up to help us because they had experience with nuthatches. It was just really special. Then we got some really cool media attention after the release. We were featured in Audubon magazine. We made the BBC Wildlife's top 50 reasons to be cheerful in 2021. I mean, that's pretty cool, like the BBC. But also, there really weren't that many things to be cheerful about in 2021. Let's just ignore that little detail. And then we were in the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Living Bird magazine. So I think it was a bright conservation spot in an otherwise pretty dismal year. Also, one more plug for woodlands. So if you haven't spent much time in woodlands or birded in woodlands, they're just incredibly diverse system for a lot of different species. They can support all these type of nesting species, and they're also great for game species, and they're also great for birding. So I encourage you guys to get down to see these pine woodlands in this part of the state and look for our nuthatches. This is just a beautiful habitat and a beautiful system. I'm hoping birders will go down there and spend money in this part of the state because birding is also a major economic driver. So thank you everybody for your attention. I really appreciate it. And oh, hold on. The best part. Got a slow-mo release of the birds flying off into our pine woodlands. Yay! Thanks, everybody. Need this back.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Okay, our next guest is Pete Montesel. He's an assistant research professor at the University of Missouri and associate professor of English at Columbia College, where he serves as director of general education. My son's a Columbia College graduate. An active birder since 2016, Pete Montesel is especially interested in warblers, raptors, and shorebirds. He serves as one of the 7 members of the Missouri Bird Records Committee and is a reviewer for eBird, an online shared birdwatching resource. His focus is 4 mid-Missouri counties, including Boone. Tonight, Pete will introduce us to eBird, a platform that unites birders from beginners to researchers. Please welcome Pete Montesel.
Well, to be clear, I am not a research professor at the University of Missouri, although I appreciate you adding that. But I did do my graduate work at the University of Missouri, like Sarah, all in English. I think that I sometimes tell people that if I had to do it over again, despite the fact that I love my students and I love my work and I love literature, that I may very well have been an ornithologist. And I actually didn't discover birds and birding my passion for birds and birding until about 5 years ago. And that escalated quickly. As my friend Sarah Kendrick is fond of saying, birds are awesome. Yeah. And they are so awesome. And they inspire me every day, and I spend a lot of time in the field. I love it. I'm proud to call myself a birder, among many other things. Thank you for giving me a moment of your time to talk about the eBird web application, how and why to use it. This beautiful, relatively nondescript bird is a Swainson's thrush. It is a common transient in Missouri, meaning that they migrate through in large numbers in the spring and fall. And you could actually go into the forest right now and you might find one. The resource that you're looking at here is a bird ID guide called Merlin, and it is integrated with eBird. The photos that you're seeing there are taken by eBird users. As this page tells you, Swainson's thrush is distinguishable from other similar thrushes by the presence of a buffy or a yellow-brown face and eye ring. You can even on this page listen to the vocalizations of Swainson's thrush, and you can hear that this flute-like melody seems to spiral upward. It's just gorgeous to hear this. This is an abundance map of Swainson's thrush. Now, Sarah also showed you an abundance map of brown-headed nuthatch. But what she couldn't show you was this. So brown-headed nuthatch is a sedentary species, right? Swainson's thrush is not. Swainson's is highly migratory. And you can see that they spend the winter in southern Mexico, Central America, and in the Andes. And in the spring, northward across the Gulf of Mexico, which is amazing in and of itself, the United States, and breed in the northwestern United States and in the boreal forests of Canada. And then, of course, they repeat that pattern in reverse in the fall. So a visual like this is provided by eBird based on sightings from eBird users. eBird is incredibly powerful. This is just one type of stunning visual that they're able to provide. Say you want to find a Swainson's thrush in our area. Well, one thing you can do is consult the bar chart, like this one. You can see that Swainson's thrush occurrences cluster in the spring and in the fall, much like closely related thrushes, the veery and the gray-cheeked thrush. So that will tell you when to find them, but where do you look? This is our immediate area, and this is where Swainson's thrush has been reported. The red location pinpoints are where they've been reported most recently. Again, just a couple of the types of amazing resources that eBird is able to provide. What is eBird? Well, first let me direct you to the eBird About page, and there's a wonderful 3-minute video there, which I'm not going to play for you now, that will do a better job of introducing eBird than I can do on this slide. eBird is, as that page tells you, a database of worldwide bird distribution, abundance, habitat use, and trends. It was founded in 2002 as a collaboration between the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and the National Audubon Society. It is managed by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's a massive citizen science endeavor used by researchers. eBird has hundreds of thousands of users, birders like me. It's a tool that birders use to record and share their sightings, log their various life and year lists, and to find more birds, as I've already talked about. So eBird currently houses, get this, more than 500 million bird observations. And in conjunction with Macaulay Library, it's a repository of birds' photos, sound recordings, and videos. More than 30 million photos, more than 1 million sound recordings, more than 1.5, or 1.5, one more time, 150,000 recordings. So what do you get from eBird? It's a free way to log and share your bird sightings, whether you're on an intentional bird outing or not. So say that you are driving or gardening and you see a bird that you want to report. Even though you're not intentionally birding, you can still do that. As I've said, it's a good way to find more birds. You can search for bird hotspots, such as commonly used birding locations, such as Eagle Bluffs Conservation Area, where I was yesterday with our distinguished guest, Noah. And you can use species maps and eBird alerts to locate birds that you really want to see. Those alerts will actually email you when a bird that you want to see is in your area. And you can get those alerts when a rare bird is in your area. Because I chase rare birds, I use that a lot. It's a place to store and share your bird media, and you get the opportunity to contribute valuable data to science. The fundamental unit of eBird is the checklist, which is a list of birds observed, meaning heard and/or seen, along with supporting documentation as necessary. Checklists begin with details about the effort that produced the checklist, location, date, time, protocol, so that can be stationary, traveling, incidental, etc. Number of observers, introductory comments, and more. And they're logged into eBird according to location, so county, state, country, hotspot. These are just a few of the checklists submitted for the state of Missouri on October 4th. If you click on any of these dates, that will open up the list of birds that were seen by that particular observer on that date and at that location. So you can quickly find where people are seeing birds that you might want to see. Note on the right-hand side of the page that there are top media, top photos taken by eBird users. These are the highest rated photos for a given range of dates. There's a number of beautiful photos of a great horned owl. The bird below that is LeConte sparrow. It's got that wonderful yellow face. And then below that, the streaky brown bird is a sedge-wren. eBird tells us that there are 418 species that have been reported to eBird in Missouri. In fact, more species than that have been observed in Missouri, but this is the number that have been reported on eBird. 504.7 thousand complete checklists. 15.7 thousand unique eBirders have submitted checklists within the bounds of the state. We have 115 counties, including the city of St. Louis, and 1,888 hotspots. So many impressive numbers here. This is the beginning of one of my checklists, which I share with my friend and colleague Paul McKenzie. This was at Eagle Bluffs Conservation Area, which of course is southwest of southwest of Columbia on the Missouri River. And you can see that we entered the birds that we saw, the numbers in which we saw them. We were also able to upload some photos that we took. Here there are a few photos of a small flock of northern pintail that flew over us. and some photos of an up-close and personal encounter with a pectoral sandpiper, a juvenile bird that walked up to us and fed within 10 feet of us for about 10 minutes. It was really a wonderful experience with this bird. You can see that under the names of the species we are able to enter details. So we had a really wonderful bird outing here. We flushed up 60 rails as we were walking through this one particular wetland. These soars were just flying out everywhere. And we ended up estimating 60. There were certainly more than that. You enter checklists by means of a filter. So this is just a part of the filter for that date. It's much longer than this. I'm just showing you the first screen of it. And say you saw, like we did, 8 northern pintail, you would just enter 8 next to the northern pintail, which is down at the bottom of the filter here. What I'm showing you is the filter that's available through the eBird mobile app, which you can download from any app store. It is totally free. You can also do this through the checklist, but there's no reason not to use the app because you can carry that with you on your mobile device, and you can enter it that way. This is the entry screen for the app. So this is where you enter the date and the time, and the app will actually track your route if you're traveling. So it will do that via GPS, and you can turn that on or off depending on whether you want to be tracked or not. Also, later in the process, you can choose to use a hotspot if you've been within the bounds of a hotspot. I'll talk a little bit about eBird quality control, something that I'm very familiar with, having served as a reviewer for the website for more than a year and a half now. So, of course, eBird users should be sure of their sightings when reporting. I'm obligated to tell you that. If you report a bird that is rare for a location and/or season for a particular range of dates, or if you report an especially large number of an expected species, then the record gets flagged. And flagging is done by means of the filter. So if you enter a species that's not on the filter or a count that's higher than expected for a normal outing in the region, your record is going to trip the filter and become flagged, and that's when I will see it as an eBird reviewer. For any flagged record, you need to enter supporting documentation before the system will log your checklist. So you need to say, this is why I saw what I think I saw, and this is why I believe that the number I'm reporting is accurate. Flag records are reviewed by volunteer regional reviewers like me who have experience birding the regions they review, and reviewers can do a number of things. They could accept a record into the public database if the documentation is sufficient. We do that with great joy. We can request more information before making a decision. We do that via email. And finally, we can choose not to accept a record if the documentation is mistaken or insufficient. The Missouri eBird review team consists of 6 members. 3 of them review for the whole state, and 3 of them, like me, are regional reviewers. So we use our knowledge of bird distributions and field marks, both visual and oral. We consult with other reviewers, and we do the best we can to be helpful and correct. We are often correct, sometimes we're not, and we appreciate your patience. And these are the counties that I review. I promise that this is a coincidence. I own more than one jacket. This makes sense because I live in Jefferson City and more or less at the confluence of Boone, Callaway, and Cole counties. And I bird all of those areas regularly. I also bird up in Howard County, where there are a number of high-quality conservation areas that are north of the Missouri River. What does an eBird reviewer want to know? Well, ideally, a diagnostic photo or audio recording is attached to a report of a rare bird. So say that Paul and I had seen that pectoral sandpiper out of season. Wouldn't it be great if we were able to attach a photo and say, so we could say, this is exactly what we saw. See the photo. But don't feel bad if you can't get a photo. That happens. You don't always see birds in ideal conditions, and they do not sit still. So if that's the case, what you do is you type in a description of the bird, and you include field marks that distinguish the bird from similar species. So why did I have a pectoral sandpiper and not a stilt sandpiper, not a lesser yellowlegs, not a sharp-tailed sandpiper? When reporting a high count, we need to know how the birds were counted in a way that prevents double counts and ensures a reasonable minimum. So there are two basic ways to do that. You can say, I counted these individually, or one by one, also known as count. Sometimes birds appear in very large numbers, and you can then estimate them in units. Fives, tens, hundreds, 10,000s. I did actually try counting birds in 10,000s once. It was challenging to say the least. Ed was there. So this is done by mapping in space, which is a kind of extrapolation. I'll show you what that looks like. Terrible photo. This was taken from my backyard of my neighbor's sycamore tree that really needs to come down because it's going to fall on my house. But what are those? Zooming in, you can see that these are cedar waxwings. Another common transient in Missouri. So especially in the fall, these can be present in our state in many thousands. It can be really exhilarating to see a large flock of cedar waxwings. How many birds do you think are in that photo? Sarah says 200. Any other guesses? 350 is good. It's somewhere in the middle there. 280. It is often the case, I've found, that there are more birds present than you think that there are. So, say that you got this photo. Oh, by the way, this tripped the filter. That was more than was allowable at the time. So, say that you got this photo. Well, you could put this on your eBird report, and you could just say to your reviewer, see photo. Right? But say you didn't get this photo. Say you didn't get a photo. What would you do? That's about 20 birds. So you could count 20, and then imagine mapping that region over the entire region that the birds are occupying 14 times. So you could say, count it in 20s, or 5s, 10s, whatever you were able to count them in. You could also say conservative estimate. That would be the least that you could say, but that's what we expect. So, some practice writing details. Say you saw this bird but couldn't photograph it and it tripped the filter. What do you need to write? Well, this is a Nashville warbler. If you saw this in the spring or in the fall, even now, not considered rare. Say that you saw it a month from now when these are in southern Mexico and Central America. I think Noah saw his in Guatemala. So, what do you write? I had to convince your eBird reviewer that I had a Nashville warbler in middle of November, when they should be down on their wintering grounds. You write gray head, red crown patch, green back, yellow throat and breast. Everything else you can manage. So I hope you see that bird and many others. Thank you for listening and good birding to you. Thanks to the organizers of the event, Cheryl Rosenfeld, Mizzou Botanic Garden, Columbia Audubon Society, Missouri Birding Society, my fellow presenters. Thanks to eBird, the Missouri eBird team, to my birding friends and mentors, and to Mid-Missouri eBird users for your efforts and understanding. I am one of you. I respect you. Thank you very much.
Okay, now I'd like to introduce the person who's largely either responsible for or to blame for tonight's gathering. No, I think it's been fantastic that Cheryl has shown such enthusiasm for tonight's presentations. It would not have happened without you, that's certainly. Cheryl Rosenfeld is a professor of veterinary medicine here at MU, where she is funded by the National Institute of Health to examine how fetal exposure to environmental chemicals can affect placenta and brain development. Cheryl also is an active birder who enjoys photographing birds as she observes their unique behaviors. She attributes her early interest in birds to the fact that her Hebrew name, Sephora, means bird. Her other great influence was a pair of American robins that built a nest in a shrub just outside her bedroom window when she was a girl, a bird's eye view that sparked a lifelong fascination. Cheryl Rosenfeld.
Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, so good evening. Thank you all for coming. So I thank you, Pete, as well, for that lovely introduction. In lieu of going over our featured speaker, Noah Stricker's many accomplishments, all of which you'll be hearing about, some just a fraction of what he has done so far, I'd like to talk to you about a trip I went on in June in 2019. Okay, I went to the Norwegian Arctic, and this is a place called Svalbard, okay? And it's really neat because this is where the polar bears and the walruses live. But as any of you, I was never been there, and I was quite wary of actually going so far north, okay? However, I was met by a Zodiac driver named Noah, okay, shown here. As you can see, he had a very warm and inviting smile. And at that point, I decided, well, let's go on this trip. So he convinced me that with my friend Jackie to go instead, not go back to the U.S. So I was on that boat, and later that day, they opened up the gift shop. And at the gift shop, just underneath the counter where you pay, there were several of these books, and they were titled The Thing with Feathers by Noah Strycker. And I recalled reading that book several years ago. Thereafter, I ran into Noah, the Zodiac driver, okay? And I said, are you the same Noah that wrote this book? Very stupidly. And he said, yes, I am. And he pointed out the fact that he also wrote another book called Birding Without Borders that depicted his travels in one calendar year to see the most birds that he could see. So his kind of big year globally. And I had also read that too. And that was based on an Amazon recommendation. I was quite embarrassed at this time. Okay, but I did ask then Noah, just like some of you have done tonight, to autograph a copy. I eventually purchased a second Thing with Feathers. That was my original, and that's my second one that Noah autographed. This trip was very magical. I mean, as you can imagine, going to the Arctic. And I want to talk to you about one day that stood out, though, of all others, okay? And that was the day we got all my colleagues on this boat got to see all these polar bears. And we were really excited about this. We were all photographing this beautiful polar bear. At one point, though, I turned to Noah, and I saw that he was taking pictures of this area. And he said, wow, did you see them fly into that area, into the kill site? And puzzledly looked at him and he said, what? Polar bears can't fly here, and even in the Arctic, I've never heard about this. It turned out the whole time my group was photographing this beautiful polar bear that we all came to see, what Noah was instead photographing was this ivory gull that was lured to the site because there was a dead seal, as you can see on the ice. So at that point, when I realized what Noah was photographing, I realized just how passionate he was about birds. And with that, I would like to give you the Mark Twain I consider of the birding world, Noah Strycker.
All righty. Well, Good evening, everyone. First of all, thanks, Pete, and thanks, Sarah. Birds are awesome. eBird is likewise awesome. Svalbard is awesome. I've spent a good portion of the past 7 summers or so up there and seen a fair number of polar bears and ivory gulls along the way. But here today, I want to take you a little bit farther afield, and it's genuinely great to be here. I have traveled to a few other places on this planet so far, but I have not spent very much of my time here in Missouri. I'm from Oregon, from Eugene area, and I drove through Missouri once to see a Eurasian tree sparrow in St. Louis a couple of years back, and I haven't been back since, so I'm actually taking the opportunity to spend about a full week here. I'm going to go chasing Sarah's brown-headed nuthatches around the Ozarks in a couple of days. I was out at Eagle Bluffs yesterday and went to Bradford Farm with Pete, and we tramped around, and he had an incident with quicksand he'll be happy to tell you about, and so been having a good time. But without too much further ado, this happens to be a sword-billed hummingbird. You can see these guys if you ever go to the Andes in Peru and Colombia. They have this extremely long beak for extremely long flowers, but my favorite feature of the swordbill is actually the color of its feet, which if you look closely are bubblegum pink colored, which is pretty unusual in the hummingbird world, and I just always thought that was very cute. You know how when you travel, though, to a foreign country, they always give you this little slip of paper. They're usually passing this out on the plane as you're coming in for a landing. No one ever has a pen to fill the thing out, so like fights are breaking out in the aisles as you're coming in and people are jet lagged. This is, of course, an immigration form. And having filled a few of these out over the past few years, I can tell you that most immigration forms for most countries are genuinely pretty similar, including they almost all have a spot for occupation. I don't really know about each and every one of you, but I kind of have a hard time sometimes describing myself in one word and exactly what it is that I do. So I've written all kinds of things on these forms over the years. For a long time, I was just putting writer, which I figured was a nice, suitably vague, all-encompassing term. And that was until April of 2015, I came down into the country of Jamaica. And I walked up to the counter, and the guy read my form, and then he looked me in the eyeballs, and he said, "Well, what kind of writer are you?" And I was kind of taken aback, and I said, I write books. And he said, "What kind of books?" And I said, "Books about birds." And there was this kind of awkward pause, and I could see he was suddenly starting to size me up, like this single male, young, disheveled-looking traveler with no luggage to speak of, coming into Jamaica, saying he writes books about birds of all things. Yeah, right. So he started asking me all these searching questions about who I was and where I was from and what my intentions were for the country of Jamaica that day. And I just wanted to say, look, I'm on a round-the-world bird-watching binge trying to become the first human in recorded history to see 5,000 species of birds in one calendar year. I have 27 hours to see all 29 endemic species on this tiny Caribbean island. My friends are waiting outside on the curb. Will you please just let me through? Which I did not say. And he did eventually let me pass, but I learned my lesson. So on every immigration form I've ever filled out since then, I've just written Birdman as my occupation, and no one has ever said a word since about it. Did anybody see this movie when it came out or remember? It's okay, you don't have to admit it, but this was 2011 Hollywood flick starring Jack Black, Owen Wilson, Steve Martin, playing bird watchers. This was actually based on a true story of 3 gentlemen who went around North America in 1998 trying to outdo each other by spotting as many species of birds as they could. But this whole idea of a big year actually goes back quite a bit further than that in the birdwatching scene, even back to the days of Roger Tory Peterson back in the 1950s. Did this big road trip across the US, which he later wrote into a book, which I highly recommend you read if you haven't already. It's called Wild America. And it was literally in the last chapter of that book that Mr. Peterson wrote in a footnote at the bottom of a page, something like, During my travels in 1953, I observed 573 species of birds, period. Well, other people read that footnote and went, I could see more birds than that, and so the big year was born. And in the decades since then, the stakes have kind of been escalating ever since. And so today, you've got guys like Olaf here, did a big year just a couple of years back, again in the US, with some special rules attached. Olaf said he had to spot every bird that year in the nude. He was very specific about it. He said he could not see the bird and then remove his clothing. He actually had to be fully naked when he first saw the bird to count it on his list. He ended up with like 600 species by the end of that year, which I think is incredible, mostly that I didn't get arrested 12 times by the end of this adventure. But in any case, that's kind of where we've come these days with big years, at least on a continental North American level. And yet, no one had ever really taken this idea and applied it properly, I thought, to its logical extreme, which I always thought was kind of interesting, because if you look at the world from a bird's eye view, they don't recognize our international borders. They don't need visas and passports and immigration forms to travel, of course. So if you really wanted to do a big year for the birds, then the ultimate one would have to be taking on all of planet Earth. And there was some precedent for this idea. In 2008, a couple of British twitchers, as they call them over there, Alan and Ruth, did a bunch of birding, and they ended up the end of that year having seen 4,341 out of the approximately 10,000 species of birds on planet Earth, which was good enough for a new single-year bird-watching world record. I read their travelogue, The Biggest Twitch, and was quite inspired by this whole thing. But then I got to the end, and I guess kind of like all the people who read Peterson's book in the 50s, I just thought, well, I could see more birds than that if I really put my mind to it. So this was lodged in my brain. But I came to this big year through a somewhat more circuitous route. And I think for me, it all started in 2011, incidentally, the same year that Hollywood movie came out. I was off on a whole different adventure, hiking the entire Pacific Crest Trail, which goes all the way from the Mexican border up through California, Oregon, and Washington to Canada. That's a whole other story. But I will say, when you spend 4 months literally wandering through the woods all day, every day, much of that time on your own, you eventually start to think of increasingly crazy ideas, and halfway through I started thinking, well, what's the next great adventure going to be? And I started thinking about big years and how fun it might be to do one someday because I'm a birder. And so by the time I got to Canada at the end of that summer, I kind of had this idea sketched out in the back of my mind, just in case the opportunity should ever happen to come up. And then, in 2014, I wrote this book, which Cheryl mentioned, The Thing with Feathers. It's all about bird behavior and how they kind of act like people sometimes. You don't really expect a book of essays about bird behavior to become anything like a bestseller, exactly. Although it kind of was. It was in People magazine, and it was on the New York Times bestseller list, and it's been translated into like 15 different languages at this point. And so after that happened, I was quite surprised, and then I sat down and I said, well, okay. And I wrote a proposal, and I basically said, for my next book, I want to go around the world and look at birds for a year and write a story about it. And I sent this off, kind of laughing about it. And then the publisher, Houghton Mifflin, came back and they said, yep, sounds like a good plan. In fact, we'll give you an advance up front that should be just about enough to cover the cost of the entire trip. And that's when I suddenly went, oh, crap. So, just in terms of strategy, I knew from the very beginning this was obviously going to be a very international trip in scale. But I still wanted to keep it as local in scope as possible. So I set a couple of special rules for myself at the outset. Fully clothed, of course. I said, first of all, every bird I found would have to be witnessed by myself and at least one other birder. which incidentally would give me witnesses for all these sightings all along the way. Second of all of those other people would have to be locals living in the same country that I was visiting. So no hiring international tour guides or importing my friends from back home to keep me company. This was really more about seeking out like-minded bird nerds in all of these far-flung places, calling them up ahead of time and basically saying, hey, I'm doing a big year. Can I sleep on your couch for a few days? And do you want to do some birding? So this, for instance, is just a group of some of the birders who took me out for one morning in northern Borneo when I showed up there. You start multiplying this out, and by the end of this adventure, I would have met literally hundreds and hundreds of all these local birders in all these different places along the way. I had learned a few lessons about packing light from hiking the PCT, so I applied those to this trip as well. This is pretty much everything I took for an entire year of traveling around the world. I went down to REI and I got myself a 40-liter backpack, which you can see there in the upper left corner. And I told myself, if it doesn't fit in here, then I guess I don't need it this year. Although I definitely did need, my binoculars and a spotting scope and a tripod and a little zoom camera there and my laptop, which left just enough room around the edges for, an extra pair of underwear and some other odds and ends. There's like malaria tablets in here for Africa. That silk thing is a sleeping bag liner that I could wriggle up inside and crash on people's floors when I had to. But other than that, I think it's really true in travel and many other things in life that the farther you go, the less you end up needing to take with you along the way. Although, one thing I definitely did need was reference material, because as a birder, you need your field guides to be able to figure out what you're seeing. This is just some of the field guides covering the countries that I plan to visit during this trip. So I hemmed and hawed about this, and I ended up either photographing or scanning all of the plate pages out of every single one of these field guides and loading those onto my phone and my laptop. So I had this whole library with me in the field, which was very useful. It was quite a bit of work, as it turned out, to do all of that scanning up front. And then the fun part. Okay, so you've got 365 days to track down as many bird species as possible on planet Earth. Where do you want to go? I remember as soon as I knew that I was going to do this, I laid out a world map on my living room floor, and I started excitedly, putting down dots on all of the places I absolutely had to go and could not miss. And after about a half an hour of that, I suddenly realized that just to get to the places I had already marked out was going to take me about 10 years to get to all of them. It turns out that 1 year is a remarkably short amount of time to try to cover this much territory. So I had to be pretty strategic about prioritizing the places with the highest diversity, of course. So it tends to be concentrated in the tropics, but also not forgetting about places with lots of endemic species, like Jamaica, for instance, that you can't see anywhere else. So it was a balance. I approached this itinerary as a continuous one-way trip. So one long series of one-way tickets, essentially, going west to east, which meant that I would not be going home at all this year, except for once briefly when I passed through the US about halfway through. And it meant that I would have new territory to look forward to ahead of me right up until the very last day, which I figured would help keep that momentum going and help keep me from getting burned out along the way. And so, with this all laid out ahead of me, on the 1st of January, 2015, I found myself on a ship floating off the coast of the Antarctic Peninsula at the stroke of midnight, where it's 24 hours of daylight, searching for penguins, because penguins are very special to me in many ways, and I wanted them to be one of my first birds of the year. As it turned out, the chinstrap was almost the first bird of the year. It went down as number 4. Officially, number 1 was a Cape petrel, this nice Southern Ocean seabird. And so there we go. I was off and running. But I feel like, this is kind of how a lot of people see birding and especially this type of birding, where you go out somewhere, you find an awesome bird, like a chinstrap penguin in Antarctica, and so you sneak up as close as you can, and you drink in the views, and you maybe snap a photo, maybe not necessarily required, and then at some point, you go, yes, and you smack a high five with your friend, and then you go, check, and then you turn around, and then you instantly transform that bird into just one more check mark on your list. And I guess by kicking off this year in Antarctica, which was probably the least strategically placed, there's only like 20 species of birds on the entire continent of Antarctica. I wanted to kind of make this subtle statement from the very beginning that, yeah, my goal is to find 5,000 birds this year. That was the whole motivation. But if you just take one step back, it's easy to see that it's not just about the birds. It's also about the people that are there alongside you, enjoying this amazing experience. And if you take another step back, it's also about these amazing landscapes and environments that birds live in that you get to visit when you're out there looking for them. I mean, this massive sea ice in the Weddell Sea in Antarctica, there are some penguins in this picture right there for a sense of scale. So, yeah, it was about the birds, it was about the people, the places, the cultures, the foods, the landscapes, the adventures, the misadventures, all of the above is why I wanted to do this big year and set out on the start of January 1st. Still, after a full week in Antarctica, I still needed to find like 4,990 more birds to make it to my goal, so I did have to kind of hit the ground running when I got up into South America, and I just started working my way north. I hit Argentina, Chile, several different parts of Brazil, and then I hopped my way up to Peru by early February, and on Valentine's Day, the 14th of February, I got higher than I've ever been anywhere in my entire life this afternoon. This was at a place called Ticlio Pass, which is at about 16,000 feet above sea level. And here I was going to spend the next couple weeks birding all around Peru with this gentleman, whose name is Gunnar. He is a Swedish birder who moved to Peru decades ago when it was actually a pretty sketchy place for foreigners to travel, just because he wanted to be immersed in the fabulous bird life of this tropical country. And as far as I can tell, Gunnar has pretty much flourished there ever since. And when I first sent him an email just asking if he might be available for these certain dates to go birding, he immediately replied with one sentence in all caps that just said, "I am your man," with like 10 exclamation points. And when I arrived, I realized he always wears this hat with, again, in all caps, "more birds" embroidered across the front. So I figured he was probably right. We had some adventures together for the next few days in Peru. We went to the rainforest in the rainy season, and it pretty much never stopped raining on us the entire time we were there. I got a case of chiggers on my feet, which was quite itchy for a while there. This bus hit a tractor in the middle of a highway. Incidentally, on the same day, I came down with a severe respiratory flu, which lingered for a couple of weeks. Another bus got stuck on a bridge, and it took them a few hours to figure out how they were going to dig this thing out so we could make our way around it. We had a dead battery in a driving rainstorm on the edge of a cliff in the absolute middle of nowhere, and once we got that sorted out, there were several flat tires trying to get up and down my new road. We got stuck in the mud a couple times and had to be towed out by passing vehicles. There was a landslide, had taken out the road. People have been sitting here for 3 days, cooking their dinners on campfires, waiting for the heavy equipment to clear it. We actually timed it pretty well. We only had to wait for like 2 hours before we got through this one, only to find that there was another landslide like 10 kilometers farther up the road, which had completely taken it out. It didn't even matter at that point because an agricultural workers' strike had shut down the highlands that we wanted to go to, so it was on to plan X or Y or whatever it was by then. Yet, Gunnar and I persevered, and we eventually made it up to this patch of elfin cloud forest in central Peru, at about 13,000 feet. This wasn't an easy spot to get to. We had to leave our accommodation at about 2 o'clock in the morning, drive in the dark up this heinous track hacked into the side of a volcano to get to the top at dawn, to then be in position to walk into this forest and look for a bird called the golden-backed mountain tanager, which is super endemic. Basically, the only place you can find a golden-backed mountain tanager is within the confines of this photo and in the forest that you're looking at. Well, I don't know what the big deal is. Like half an hour after we walked into the woods, this bird popped out of a tree, bright yellow, black wings, black tail. You can see a little blue on the top of its head if you look closely. Absolutely unmistakably the golden-backed mountain tanager. Pretty nice to get an easy bird for a change in central Peru. So that went down as bird number 1,126 by the 17th of February. But as it turned out, the saga of this mountain tanager was not quite finished yet, because after we've drunk in the views and smacked our high fives and celebrated, Gunnar and I turned around and wandered back to where he had parked our van at the top of this mountain in the half light of dawn. He'd managed to get it wedged in the ditch, where once again we were unfortunately stuck in the mud. So I walked around to the back and kind of sighed and got in position to push it out, as I'd become accustomed to lately. And Gunnar got in the driver's seat to drive it out, and he stuck the key in and turned it. And then he leaned his head out the window and shouted back, "Well, I think we've got another dead battery here." So I sighed again, and I walked up the right side of the van to confer, and looked down, and it just happened to notice that not one but both of our right tires were also completely flat, apparently from rock punctures from this terrible road that we'd driven up in the dark. Not only that, the entire rear bumper assembly of the van was just gone, missing, ripped off by a rock. It's probably still on the side of that mountain somewhere, fallen down who knows how far the cliff. And so here we are, stuck in the mud with a dead battery, 2 flat tires, and a missing bumper, incidentally with a plane to catch that same afternoon. I was like, Gunnar, I don't think we're going to walk out of here this time. We probably need to just start walking at this point. We're not going to get help in the middle of nowhere here. And he said, yeah, you're probably right. So I was fine. I just had my little backpack. I put that on, started walking down the mountain. No idea how far we'd have to go before we found someone to help us. And Gunnar, meanwhile, gets his stuff out and starts walking down behind me with 2 big airport wheelie bags of luggage, one dangling from each hand. And we had to go a couple of miles like that before finally, thankfully, we came around a corner and found this group of Andean potato farmers, these teenagers who looked up with the expressions you might assume a group of Andean potato farmers would have upon seeing a couple of gringo-looking gentlemen walking down their mountain carrying airport luggage in both hands. But Gunnar did not miss a beat. He put down one of his bags and he unzipped it to show that it was completely stuffed full of fresh oranges. And I just started laughing. I was like, Gunnar, that must weigh like 40 pounds. Were you going to carry these oranges all the way down the mountain? And he was like, yeah, but watch this. And he started tossing the oranges out to all the farmers, whose expressions then lit up. Everything changed. They hopped up and said, okay, who wants a ride down? Which meant that I just managed to make it to the airport in the nick of time that afternoon to get up to the gate and have the gate attendant look at us with a big smile and say, your flight has been canceled. I did eventually make it out of Peru with some pretty good birds to show for it along the way. And I continued on my way, hopping just a short distance up into the cloud forest of western Ecuador, because I wanted to make a pilgrimage here to visit an angel of peace. Literally, the name of this guy is Angel Paz. Some of you may have heard of him. He is somewhat of a legend in Ecuador, especially in the birding world, because in a former life, this particular angel used to be a logger, and he was cutting down the trees on their beautiful cloud forest property when one day, a couple of birders happened by, and they asked him, hey, Angel, do you know where we might be able to find an Andean cock of the rock? This bizarre neon orange bird that lives in Andean cloud forests. And Angel said, oh, you mean those red birds? Yeah, I got some out back. I guess I could show you. So they started wandering back up the trail to go see the cock of the rock lek. But before they got there, Suddenly, this little brown bird hopped out of the bushes into the middle of the path right at their feet. And the birders froze in their tracks, and they said, "Angel, forget about the cocks of the rock. If you can show this brown bird to visitors, they will pay you money just to come see it because it is so rare." And then they left very happily. And Angel got thinking about this, and he thought, well, I know that brown bird. In fact, it follows me around in the woods sometimes when I'm logging because it likes to come out when it's disturbed and eat the worms from the soil. Maybe I can make friends with it. In fact, I've already given her a nickname. I call her Maria. So he set about on a campaign to befriend this bird, Maria. Fast forward several years, I landed in Ecuador, met up with Angel Paz on his property. He took me out into the woods along a trail. He had some worms in a leaf, which you can see he set down there on a post in the lower right-hand corner. And then he put his hands to his mouth, and he called, "Maria, Maria, venga, 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 venga." About 20 seconds later, this bird hops out of the bushes right at our feet. This bird is called a giant ant pitta. It is pretty much the only place in the world you can see a giant ant pitta these days, unless you want to thrash around in the cloud forest for a couple months and hope you get lucky. Angel Paz tossed Maria a couple of worms, which she ate very gratefully, as she does every morning at 7 a.m., and lingered, showed off both of her best sides, and then hopped back into the bushes. And I thought, well, that's awesome. Show's over. However, Angel has learned a few more tricks in the past few years, so after that, we wandered a little farther up the trail, and he then did the same thing with the yellow-breasted ant pitta. Then he did the same thing with the chestnut-crowned ant pitta. And then he did the same thing with this one, maybe my personal favorite, the ochre-breasted ant pitta. And Angel has his own nicknames for all of these birds. This one he calls Shakira, because the ochre-breasted has a unique habit of twitching its chest from side to side when it gets very, very excited. Angel has done quite well for himself with this ant pitta befriending operation. When I arrived, he had just finished building himself and his family this beautiful new 3-story house on his property in the cloud forest with extra rooms upstairs for visiting birders to stay in with hand-carved ant pitta artwork embedded in the walls and all of these amazing finishes. He's visited now by thousands of birders every year, each of whom pays an entrance fee to visit his property and see Maria, the giant ant pitta, and friends. And I just think this whole thing is amazing. It's an example of a conservation success story, because here's a guy who discovered all on his own that instead of cutting down his forest, he could find a much better living and actually kind of become the king of his village by keeping that forest completely intact. So I continued on my way north from Ecuador. I jumped from Colombia to Panama, Costa Rica, spent my day in Jamaica and said hello to the immigration official, went back to Mexico, and then crossed into the border into Texas in late May. I didn't really spend too much time here in my home country. I spent 2 days in South Texas, 2 days in Southeast Arizona, a good birding spot, 1 long day outside of Los Angeles. I went through Oregon, where I lived for a few days, partly so I could get a haircut on the way through. And then my last stop in the Western Hemisphere was in the state of New York. I landed in Ithaca for a couple of days because I wanted to visit some friends there from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, including this guy. His name is Tim. He works at eBird, actually. He had volunteered to take me around for a few days around the outskirts of Ithaca, looking for these common New York birds that he gets to see there all the time, but I hadn't seen yet because I hadn't been to Eastern North America yet this year. So we were checking them off, looking at things like upland sandpipers, and I think we were really looking for an American black duck that afternoon. And we're driving down the highway, and Tim suddenly gets this message on his phone, and he slams on the brakes, and we skid off to the side of the highway, and he's sitting there vibrating in his seat. And I knew that expression. I was like, Tim, what is it? What rare bird has just been reported in this area? And he just went, you are not going to believe this. And I said, what? And he said, a brown pelican has just been seen on Cayuga Lake. Do you realize how this is like the first inland record of a brown pelican ever in this part of New York State? We have to go find it right now so I can get it for my county list before it flies away. And I was like, Tim, okay, that's very exciting. You know, I just saw like 10,000 brown pelicans last week in California where they're supposed to be. I don't really need to see this one. In fact, I kind of need to find a black duck this afternoon. And you could see this look of horror crossing Tim's face. But, you know, I knew the feeling, because when rarities show up around where I live, I'm often the first one out the door to try to go track them down. So we made a compromise on a detour to try to go see this wayward pelican before continuing with our quest. And meanwhile, the WhatsApp reports were coming in with literally up to the second updates of speed and direction of the pelican as it was cruising up the lakeshore. So we were able to get ahead of it and position ourselves at a certain marina just a couple minutes before looking off in the prescribed direction. A speck appeared over the horizon, got closer and closer, and sure enough, this brown pelican flew right over our heads. And then it continued on over downtown Ithaca, where the reports kept coming in. It's over the farmer's market right now. It's over campus right now. Leave class, get outside, look at the sky. All of which I found highly entertaining, especially when we then later went and actually found me an American black duck for my year list, which is like a trash bird locally. I guess this is a good example of how doing a big year on a global scale totally flips the strategy over from doing it on any smaller scale. Even if you're crazy enough to take on an entire continent, like those guys in the Hollywood big year movie were, you're pretty much totally reliant on finding these lost, out-of-range, vagrant birds that blow into your area, and then when that happens, you've got to drop everything and go where it is and see that one individual bird before it can disappear or turn around and fly back over the border and you can't count it anymore. But if you just do the whole planet, you don't have to worry about vagrant birds. In fact, you are not really rewarded at all for seeing them outside of their range, because eventually you just go find them in the places where they're really supposed to be. And I actually found that kind of refreshing about this trip, that it was more about tracking down the common, local, resident species in each place than it was about this kind of like ambulance chasing, looking for lost vagrants that birders tend to do a lot of the time. So I continued on from New York, but my worst delay of the entire year was trying to leave New York City. Of all places, a year in the third world, more or less, and I couldn't get out of New York City. I was delayed by 27 hours, which was kind of a bummer because I had planned my next short layover to be in Iceland for just over 1 day and pick up all my Arctic birds there before continuing on over to Europe. And when the new itinerary came down, they had me landing in Reykjavik at midnight and then taking off again shortly before 6 o'clock a.m. I was like, well, thanks, United/American Airlines. There goes Iceland and all my Arctic species this year. But then I cooled down a little bit, and I thought about it, and I realized it was June. It doesn't get dark in Iceland during the northern summer. So I called up my local contact birder who I'd arranged with there, this nice guy named Jan, and I explained the situation. I said, don't worry about it. I'll just find a taxi, drive around the city for a couple hours, see what birds I can find, and then I'll continue on my way. But, you know, just if you wanted to, might be kind of fun to pull an all-nighter. And he didn't even hesitate. He said, yeah, sounds good. I'll see you there when you land. So sure enough, I came down in Reykjavik at the stroke of midnight, and within minutes, Jan and I were scoping for Manx shearwaters offshore. And then for the next several hours, we raced around Reykjavik together, racking up birds left and right. We got my Atlantic puffin for the year at 3 o'clock in the morning at this sea cliff. Then we picked off whooper swans by the road at 4 a.m., 5 a.m. There was a black-tailed godwit in a roadside pond. I mean, even the common species were new for me because I hadn't been to that latitude yet this year. So here I got 3 new birds at once: gray-lag goose, Arctic tern, black-headed gull. Like every bird we saw was new for my list. We ended up at our last stop before we had to go back to the airport at this lagoon, which was as I discovered just outside the presidential palace there in the background. And I could just imagine the president of Iceland sleeping soundly when this photo was taken, probably dreaming of his amazing yard list of birds he spotted from the palace. And I turned to Jan and I said, man, I can't thank you enough. Do you realize we've just seen 54 species of birds between midnight and 6 a.m.? I hope you can at least go home now and get some sleep. And he kind of smiled and he said, yeah, well, kind of. And I said, what do you mean, kind of? And he said, well, I'm not exactly from Reykjavik. And I said, what do you mean? Where do you live? And he said, I actually live up in northern Iceland, so I had to drive for about 5 hours just to come meet you at the airport at midnight. We've been birding now till it's 6 in the morning. I'm gonna sleep here in the parking lot of my truck for about an hour before I need to turn around and drive 5 hours back home because I'm actually due at work this morning. This is the kind of generosity that you run into when you have a passionate project like this, and I just hit up against it over and over and over again throughout this year, and it just completely blew me away every time. So, not having slept myself with all the various delays involved at this point in about a day and a half to 2 days, I took the short hop from Reykjavik over to Oslo, Norway, walked out of the arrivals hall and met my next contact there, this very nice Norwegian birder named Bjorn, in the Oslo cemetery, actually. Pretty good birding spot. And it was sort of like swapping in fresh horses for the Western Mail Service or something at this point, because of course Bjorn was very well rested, and he was not about to let me miss any birds in Norway, his home turf, which would like reflect poorly on his own birding abilities. So his plan for us two for the next 4 days in central Norway, where it also does not really get dark during the northern summer, was that we'd drive around together during the day and pick off amazing birds, like these breeding Lapland longspurs up on the mountain slopes as the snow was melting off. And then whenever it started to get, towards sundown, around about 11:30 p.m., he just brought along a couple sleeping bags. We'd throw those down on the forest floor, couple hours of sleep, and then when the sun came back up at 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, we'd keep going. And after 4 more days of that, I was about ready to say, I need to go to a country where it gets dark. I am going to die. This is not sustainable. But it was kind of fun, admittedly, to be camping out in the woods like this, partly because when I had kicked off this whole adventure, I had agreed to write a daily blog on the National Audubon Society's website so people could follow the progress. And when Audubon set up the blog, they sent a photographer to my house in Oregon to take a photo that would serve as the illustration for the blog's home landing page. So here is the picture that photographer came up with. This photo is pretty much completely fake, okay? I'm sitting there in a sleeping bag reading a copy of my own book while I'm spotlighting an owl up there that's a plastic owl that's been nailed to the top of that tree. This was taken in like broad daylight with strobe lights to make it look like it was happening after dark. And so I'd been looking at this totally faked photo on my own blog's homepage every day for the whole year and kind of laughing about it until on the 3rd evening in Norway, Bjorn and I, in this haze of sleep deprivation on some forest road, threw down our sleeping bags and crawled in, and just before we passed out unconscious for the next couple of hours, we heard in the distance the sound of a tawny owl calling from the forest, and Bjorn pulled out his cell phone, and from it he played a snippet of a tawny owl's vocalization, which of course the owl thought was another owl, so it flew in and landed in a tree right over our heads, and from his sleeping bag, Bjorn spotlighted the owl sitting there on a branch right over our heads. So in the end, the faked blog photo actually ended up coming almost 100% true in central Norway. Kind of like the US, I didn't spend too much time in Europe. A few days in Norway, a couple days in Turkey and Spain, and then I dropped down into Africa for the next 2.5 months. And I have to say, for me, personally, Africa was probably the most exotic, adventurous feeling leg of this trip, partly because it was the only continent I had never visited before I first set out on this adventure. So yeah, the landscape suddenly changed dramatically, the culture and all the people changed dramatically, and all of a sudden, besides birds, there's all these other animals around all the time, which is super cool, especially if you've never seen any of them before in the wild. Also sort of distracting when you're looking for little brown birds in the bushes nearby. But I mean, it was amazing to get sightings of like the big cats. I ran into lions in a few different places. I came face to face with this leopard in Kruger National Park in South Africa. I got to watch hunting cheetahs out on the Serengeti grasslands of northern Tanzania. I mean, this is like stuff you see in nature documentaries on TV. Of course, when you're looking for birds, you see everything else that's out there along the way. In fact, especially on these safari adventures, I often found that it was the groups of birders who ended up seeing more of all the other wildlife out there than the people who only went out there looking for the big obvious stuff from the start, if that makes any kind of sense. I was, however, looking for birds. So, when the elephant was at the water hole, I was pretty happy about the fish eagle perched up above its head. And when the buffalo came walking toward us, I was very happy about the yellow-billed oxpecker clinging to its back. The birds use the other animals as habitat in Africa. This doesn't really happen in other parts of the world. So you got like jacanas sitting on top of hippos and all kinds of craziness happening. But I started noticing something once we got past this southern ground hornbill crossing the street, which was that I'd be out with a couple other birders looking for birds, and we'd find something amazing, like say a giant kingfisher sitting next to the side of the road. Biggest kingfisher in the world. These things are gigantic. And so we'd stop and we'd be looking at it and taking photos and smacking high fives and all the routine that you do when you spot an amazing bird. And then after about a minute and a half, you'd turn around, and there'd be like 10 other safari trucks parked behind you, bumper to bumper, all of them wanting to know where the lion was that you were so obviously super excited about. And as soon as they realize that you're looking at some bird off in the bushes, there'd be these like expressions of disappointment and disgust even that you'd wasted precious seconds of their safari, and they all drive off in this big cloud of dust. And this got to be kind of a problem after a while. So we came up with a solution, which was that anytime we stopped to look at a bird on safari, one of us would roll down the window when someone parked behind our bumper and pick up a copy of the paper field guide with a big obvious picture of a bird on the front cover and wave that out the window at them, and they'd see it, realize we were birding, and at that point generally leave us alone. We called that maneuver flipping them the bird. After Africa, I spent another 3 months in Asia, which is also very bird rich. I was particularly impressed in many of these countries with how many birders there are. In many parts of Asia, places like the Philippines and India and Borneo, like I showed you before. And by this time of the year, it was getting to be September, October. The word had leaked out that there was a guy out there doing a World Big Year, and so when I contacted someone to go birding with them, inevitably they'd come greet me at the airport and had invited all of their friends to come along for the day as well, like I was some kind of visiting celebrity. So suddenly the Big Year in Asia turned into like this nonstop birding party with these just escorts of very happy birders every day along the way. For instance, this is a group that met me at the airport when I flew into Taipei in Taiwan. And they had already decided that they were going to take me out to see a celebrity of their own. So we went out just outside the city limits of Taipei to see this bird, which is called a Siberian crane. This was actually the first individual Siberian crane ever recorded in the country of Taiwan. I didn't find it. This bird had been there, staked out, for about 5 months before I arrived, always every day in the same flooded farmer's field next to a busy street right outside Taipei's city limits. And by this time, this crane, the Taiwanese called the little white crane, had become a legit celebrity. I went to see it. They'd set up these barricades to keep people out of the field and keep them from getting too close to this little white crane, which was just out there walking around in its field like it liked to do. There were signs translated into multiple languages about the crane. There were souvenir stands set up on the side of the highway selling crane-themed knickknacks. Again, this is like 5 months after this bird had been there all day, every day, random Tuesday afternoon. The street was lined with people and photographers taking pictures and soaking in this bird. They estimated that by this point, approximately 60,000 people had come out just to look at this one lost crane, which was rather lost. Siberian cranes should not be in Taiwan. They are highly endangered. They nest in Siberia, and they should winter in central China, theoretically. So this bird had wandered off from its flock at some point. So the question then was becoming, well, what should we do now with this bird? Should we leave it alone? Seems to be pretty happy here. Should we try to catch it and transport it back to rejoin its flock somewhere since they're so endangered? A lot of hassles with international permits involved in that kind of thing. It didn't really end up mattering in the end because about a month after I saw it, the Siberian crane one day was observed by its many paparazzi to lift off from its field and then fly out toward the city, and then somewhat disoriented, it came down in an urban subway station that evening to shelter for the night while it was filmed live for all the international news and everything. And then the following morning, it woke up and then it flew off again, and this time, much more purposefully, it flew straight out to sea and disappeared over the horizon. And so no one really knows if that crane managed to make it back to its flock somewhere along the way, or it's even maybe still out there somewhere bouncing around from one island to the next. My last country of the year was planned to be Australia, and I came down first in December in the city of Cairns, which is on the east coast. I met a local birder, this guy named Dell, and we were out one morning accompanied by a reporter from the Cairns Post newspaper who wanted to write this article about the impending end of this big year of birding. So this guy was asking me all these questions like, what bird do you most want to see in Australia? And I said, well, I've never seen a cassowary. I'd really love to find one. I don't really have a good stakeout. And he said, okay. And he wrote that down in his notebook. And the next morning, the headline came out, "Birder wants to break world record with a cassowary in Cairns." I was like, well, kind of. I would really like to see one. But a couple hours after that paper came out, I got a phone call, because my number was also in that article. And this guy came on the line, and he said, hey, I saw the headline this morning. Are you still looking for a cassowary? And I said, yeah, actually, I really don't have a good place to see one right now. Do you know where I might find one? And he said, well, I've got a cass and a couple chicks that likes to hang out around my backyard. You're welcome to come over if you want to, I guess. And I said, hold it right there. I am on my way. And jumped in the car with Dell, and we drove up into the wet tropical rainforest and what turned out to be this beautiful property overlooking the city where this very nice man met me in his front yard and then took us around back where, lo and behold, there's this bird that looks like a dinosaur with that helmet thing on top of its head and these pink wattles of skin and blue on its neck and just crazy looking animal. These things are about 6 feet tall. They have the somewhat dubious reputation of being the most dangerous bird in the world because, strictly speaking, I think they are still the only bird that has ever killed a human by blunt force trauma. They have this specially sharpened central toenail that if they kick you hard enough, they can disembowel you on the spot, and that has happened in the past. But this one was super friendly, so we didn't see much harm in hanging out with it. And its 2 chicks, definitely a father, because it's always the male that takes care of the chicks in the cassowary's kingdom. Just one of the coolest bird encounters I've ever had anywhere, thanks to this very nice man who just read about me in the newspaper that morning. Least Christmassy Christmas I've ever celebrated anywhere in my life. I'm sorry, but Southwest Australia with 95 degrees of heat, several hundred kilometers inland from Perth in the middle of nowhere, this was the only Christmas tree I saw all day on the 25th of December. fact, I didn't see another human being for most of the day, except for this very nice birder named Frank from Perth, who had volunteered to spend his entire Christmas holiday bird watching with me in the middle of nowhere, which I was eternally grateful for. But, if you're in the right festive spirit and frame of mind, then potentially any tree could be a Christmas tree on December 25th. So I was pretty happy to see this one that had a green and red bird in it to celebrate the holiday. This one is called a mulga parrot. And on the 25th of December, this mulga parrot was bird number 5,959. So I had blasted past the existing world record months earlier in India. I had passed my initial goal of 5,000 a month earlier in the Philippines, and at this point, I was within striking distance of exceeding that by 1,000 species. It was all gravy, really, at this point. But it would be kind of criminal to come so close to 6,000 and not quite get there. So we went back to Frank's house that evening, where we had Cornish game hens for dinner. I appreciate birds in many different ways, and we just painstakingly made a list of every bird I could see anywhere on the continent of Australia that I hadn't quite found yet to get 41 more species. And we figured that it just was not possible. I mean, maybe if I had a few weeks, but the distances in Australia are just too big to be able to zip around and pick all these things off. So then I said, well, Frank, it has been wonderful birding with you here. I can't thank you enough, but where in the world could I go to get 41 more birds on a couple days' notice? I've only got one shot at this. And fortunately, that same year, eBird had just come up with a brand new feature called Target Species, which will filter your sightings against everyone else's sightings in any given region of the world and spit out an ordered list by frequency of abundance of species you have not found yet that others have in any given region. So I ran that for a bunch of places I thought I might get new birds, and finally found out that in the far northeast corner of India, a country I had been to earlier, but not in that section, there was a cluster of birds in those Himalayan foothills that I hadn't found yet. And so, 24 hours after celebrating a blistering Christmas in the Australian outback, I came down in the Himalayan foothills where it was freezing cold. It was the middle of winter. It gets dark at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon because of the wacky time zones in that part of the world, and met up with this gung-ho crew of young Indian birders who were totally dedicated to going hard for the last couple days and trying to scratch out 41 more birds. We ended up spotting this one. Can you see the bird in this picture? There is one in there, I swear. Right there. This is a terrible photo of a very good bird called a yellow-rumped honey guide. And on the 29th of December, this particular yellow-rumped honey guide was bird number 6,000. So, hey, I still had 2 more days. I didn't quite stop there. No, my very last bird of the year on New Year's Eve at about 11 p.m. was this little owl called an Oriental Bay owl. I snapped a photo of it, and Ramit, who I just showed you a photo of, was standing there, and he just had this big smile, and he said, "Do you realize how rare this owl is in India?" And I said, well, no, I wasn't really expecting to find one here, but how rare is it? And he said, as far as I know, this is the first photograph ever taken of this species anywhere in the country of India. And I said, oh, well, in that case, the big year is a wrap. So, when the dust settled, I had visited 41 countries on all 7 continents. I flew almost exactly 100,000 miles when I added up all these little legs, which might sound like a lot. It ended up being like an average of 1 short flight every 3 or 4 days. So it wasn't what you might think of for a long international birding trip. I never was jet lagged the whole year because I didn't make these big leaps. I didn't really spend that much of the year in and around airports, as counterintuitive as that might sound. I think I spent about $60,000 on the whole trip, all expenses included, all the travel, food, accommodation, gear, guides in a few different places. Again, I only throw that figure out there just to say, maybe that sounds like a lot. Maybe that sounds like not so much. To me, $10 per bird seemed like a pretty small price to pay for this trip. And I think it kind of goes to show that travel, like many other things, is a priority. You can do it on a variety of different budgets if you're willing enough. Would you rather have a nice shiny SUV in your driveway, or would you rather visit 41 countries? These are the choices that we all make every day, whether it's consciously or maybe a little more subconsciously much of the time. The very second I finished my big year, another young birder from the Netherlands set out on his own round-the-world birdwatching trip, largely using this map as a blueprint and tweaking things along the way, very much gunning for my record that I had just set. And by the end of the next year, 2016, he ended up seeing a couple hundred more birds than I did. So right away, my world record was broken, which I think is amazing, and more power to him. That's what records are for. And I'm interested to see how other people might take up this challenge in the years ahead and find ways to take it in new and interesting directions. At the end of the year, I had basically turned into a bird watching machine after doing literally nothing else for 365 straight days. And my worst fear, that I would get burned out and just hate birds by the end of the year, turned out to be completely unfounded. In fact, it was much the opposite. I found that it was quite difficult to stop. On January 1st, after the year was over, well, I was in India with these gung-ho birders, so I got up at 5:30 that morning and we spent the whole day birding. And a few days later, I flew home, and then it took me a few months to kind of like step myself back down to reality and not leap out of bed every morning like, what country am I in? Now, to be honest, 6 years later, some of the names of the birds that I found that year have started to evaporate, especially in places like Africa that I hadn't traveled to before. It's kind of hard to keep your, Zitting cisticolas and oleaginous hemispinguses straight. But I do still definitely remember pretty much all of the birders that I met along the way during this adventure. These are the memories that stick with you the most when you travel, especially when you have this intense shared interest with all the people you're meeting along the way. Of course, the great thing about birds, it doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. There are birds all over the world. And so anyone can get into looking at birds and connecting with them and connecting with each other. And that means that in the end, this world really has no borders at all. So on that note, thank you very much for having me here. So we'll do questions and a book signing.
Yes, is this on or off?
Yes, on.
Yeah. Well, I guess I better use this. Before we get to our panel, Joseph, you're going to help us? Okay. While they're setting up the furniture for the panel, I want to remind you that if you enjoyed tonight's presentations, please consider a donation in the bird feeder on the middle table out in front. We also have 3 raffle items, and we're going to draw one of them now. Carlin, if you'd like to come over here, and Noah, if you can help us. A totally unbiased person is going to make the choice. Draw one out.
It is Pat Pantler.
Okay. That's a $25 gift card to Songbird Station. Is this Pat here? All right, there we go. Good. Okay, also, I'd like to remind you that we have books out in the lobby for sale, and while Noah's here, I'm sure he'd be happy to sign your book. Okay, if I could have our panelists come on up. Okay, where's Dr. Rosenfeld? Oh,
I feel so famous.
Me too.
You're more famous than me.
okay, this is how it's going to work. Dr. Rosenfeld will get this side of the audience, and I'll get the other side. Just raise your hand, and one of us will come over with the microphone. Who wants to go first?
Hi, Noah, on your map of the world, you had a very large dot over what looked like the Persian Gulf, either Iran or Saudi Arabia. Can you explain to me?
Yes, I can explain. What is the big dot over what is the UAE, United Arab Emirates? That's because that map is a bit funky. If you read the legend, it was showing average new birds per day. So that was essentially a measure of how well I had planned my itinerary. If I spent too long, that average would go down. But the dot on the UAE was because I only spent one day there on a layover, and I saw 118 species of birds that day. So my birds per day average was pretty high in the UAE. And if I had it all to do over again, strategically speaking anyway, I'd probably plan in more of those even shorter layovers so you can keep your new average, birds per day up. Although there are certain limits to human endurance.
Question on this side of the room? Come on, you guys. We got to keep up with this other side.
With the, I'm sorry, is it brown nuthatch? Right, okay,
Brown-headed, yeah.
brown-headed. How, are you able to tell how many survived that first year?
Yeah, so that's why we attached the radio tags to half the birds. We only attached it to half the birds in case there was some effect of attaching a tag. We didn't want to put them on all the birds, and if you attach it to half, that gives you a pretty good estimate. So the initial really basic survival estimates that we've come up with are about 63%, Tom. And so that's very comparable to existing breeding populations of nuthatches, plus this population is reintroduced, so it has a little extra curve to survival. But yeah, that's about what it is now. We're going to wait till we have 2 years of data to do the big analysis of all of our data to look at the survival over time, but it's looking pretty good. The birds handled, transport and release and everything really well. We don't have any confirmed mortalities. We suspect a few, but we have no confirmed, which is pretty shocking. Tom, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, so she mentioned 63%, and she mentioned doing a more thorough follow-up analysis, and that analysis will give us an idea to estimate how many of those of that remaining percentage of birds is actually, they're still alive, they've just moved out of the area to where we can't detect them. And so that 63% is probably the low end of survival. And so for our reintroduction, that's actually really good, really successful.
Yeah, we had the really cool opportunity to search for birds from our helicopter for the species or for the individuals we couldn't find on the ground, like they were outside of our search radius. And we found on the first time we did it 4 extra birds just who had roved farther out past the distance of our handheld Yagi antennas. And so I think they may be going farther than we think. They aren't in our search locations, and they may just be roving farther. So that was kind of neat.
Oh, wait. Can you
Oh
ask
yeah, I can repeat it. What are some strategies for locating these birders all over the world, not the birds themselves? Well, that was really my ultimate strategy, was to tap into this network of knowledge of all these local birders in different places. I would be able to show someone all the birds around where I live, so other people can do the same in other places. I used a few different methods. First, I already knew some, and so I contacted them. Then I asked them who they knew, and then I asked other friends who they knew, and so a lot of it was by word of mouth. There is a website called birdingpal.com, which I used in a couple of places. It's pretty cool. People will list themselves as willing hosts for any visiting birder for free. They'll just take you around and show you the birds of their local area. That's generally geared at like a day or two at a time, but I stretched it in a few different places to like a week with various local birders. And so, yeah, it was a combination of these things, but this big year would not have been even remotely possible in the same way even 10 or 15 years ago, because eBird and Birding Pal and the internet in general and listservs and all these different ways that birders connect with each other online these days have made the worldwide community of birders ultra connected. And so I was able to tap into that really effectively. Whereas, a decade or two ago, you would have been like mailing letters and calling people on the telephone. Imagine that. So I hit it at just the right time, I think.
This is about the brown-headed nuthatch. Sarah, is there any significance to the plastic-colored bands, or are they just randomly chosen, or?
So yeah, they're just randomly chosen different combinations, but all the combinations are different, whether they just have one colored band on each leg. So we have those combinations. And then if we had two bands, we could do those flipped over up and down because the bands are read left top bottom to right top bottom. And so if you flip them around, that's a whole nother combination. So yeah, we have lots of combos. We picked colors that we thought would be the easiest to see.
Hi, Noah. What was your part in the book, The Photo Arc with Joel Sartor?
Yeah, what about that book, The Photo Arc with Joel Sartori? I don't know if you're all familiar with Joel Sartori's work. He is a National Geographic photographer. And maybe a decade or so ago now, he started his own photo project called The Photo Arc, where he's from Nebraska. He travels to zoos and captive breeding facilities around the world and sets up a portable photo studio and takes these amazing face-to-face intimate portraits of all kinds of animals, including birds, of course, but all the way down to insects. His goal is to photograph like 13,000 species this way. And that is the Photo Arc, is this collection of images that he then uses to generate awareness for all these interesting animals that no one has ever really seen in this way before. So Nat Geo decided to do a bird book based on Joel's images from the Photo Arc project, and they brought me in to write all the text for it. So that came out just a couple of years ago. It's called Birds of the Photo Arc, and it's got all of Joel's amazing bird photos and some of my essays interspersed throughout about bird behavior and the significance of all the birds that he'd photographed.
I have a question for Pete Monticello while I'm walking up here. How long did it take to develop eBird? And has it ever been updated? Is there just one version or several editions of it?
So eBird is actually relatively new. 2002 was the date that eBird commenced. And there have been several updates and new features added. Noah, for instance, he mentioned target species, which is a relatively new feature of eBird that can help you find the birds that you really want to see. So eBird changes with updates all the time. And there are new features that are added, and it's continually improved.
I was wondering for both Sarah and Noah, what are you working on right now? Like, what's coming next?
Okay, I'll go first. Well, in my other career, I work as an onboard guide for expeditions to Antarctica and the high Arctic. So Cheryl mentioned I've been going up to Svalbard for the past 8 years or so. I've also been working in Antarctica, both as a guide and as a researcher. So I just finished a master's degree studying chinstrap penguins on the Antarctic Peninsula, and I'll be going back down November through February this coming season, again as a guide for a company called Quark Expeditions. If you ever want to go to Antarctica, feel free to send me an email. I'll just give you all the info. It's like I think it's a life-changing kind of place. And in between, I'm now writing a new book for Nat Geo that's going to be called Birding Basics. So it's for everyone who's just getting started in bird watching, and that should come out sometime in 2022, next year.
I'm excited for that book. So the nuthatch monitoring continues, of course. We'll be nest searching again in the spring and trying to monitor that. So that's just one thing that we work on. We're also placing MODIS wildlife tracking system stations, which you should look that up. I don't have enough time to describe it, but really they're passive receivers we place on the landscape for MODIS digitized radio tags, kind of like the ones we put on the birds. And so during long distance migrations, if they pass any of these receiver stations, there's over 1,000 in the whole world, the data is collected. So you can get migration timing, stopover locations across an entire, it's a collaborative hemispheric project where it's all on the same radio frequency. So any tagged bird can be detected on any of the stations. It's very cool. And so we've placed 16 of those in Missouri and with plans for about 10 more of those stations. And so trying to help build that network regionally and across the hemisphere. So that takes up a lot of time. And then other monitoring efforts in the state and bird counts and answering bird questions and telling people about widespread bird declines and what they can do for conservation and in their daily lives to help slow declines. So lots of different things.
So this question is for any of you to answer. Do you have an early memory or an event that sparked this passion that you have for birding?
I think we should just go in order. Do you want to start?
So, for me, my passion for birds and the conservation and science work I do with them kind of evolved out of just my love for nature and realizing that birds are just such a unique and special group when you deal with conservation. Number one, there is so much interest, which generates so much information and knowledge and data that we can often learn so much about ecology and conservation from birds, more so than a lot of other taxa groups. And then just the interesting systems that they're in. I mean, Noah's talk was amazing for just seeing the characteristics and the uniqueness in these different environments. It just kind of fuels that passion and that enthusiasm for continuing to study them.
For me, it was a teacher when I was in 5th grade. I was in Eugene, Oregon. She put a bird feeder on our classroom window, and she would stop class every time a new bird showed up and make us try to identify it using this Cornell Backyard Birds poster that she taped to the wall next to the window. I think all the other kids in the class thought it was just about the dumbest thing ever, but for me, for some reason, I was just like, this is so cool. I'm beat to nose with an evening grosbeak on our feeder. And then she put up some bluebird houses on our school grounds, and we followed the bluebirds, and it just kind of went from there. This morning, I gave a talk about penguins at one of the local middle schools, and it was pretty cool to see some of that same energy in all of these faces staring back at me. It was like on the edge of chaos throughout the entire talk this morning there because they were squirming in their seats. They were so excited to see these birds I was showing them. So I hope if I can give some of that energy back, I think my job will be done.
That's awesome. So I came around to birds later in life. So we grew up spending time outside, but I have an English undergrad degree. And so I didn't know what the heck I wanted to do. But I decided to go back to school when I was about 24 years old to take classes to get into a master's program. And I happened to take a class called ornithology, taught by John Faubourg, who's sitting right there. Hi, John. Who taught ornithology at Mizzou for about how long? 35 years? 35 years. That's how many people he inspired with ornithology. And John handed me my very first bird I ever held in the field, which was a male indigo bunting at Tucker Prairie. And so he is a massive mentor and inspiration to me. And that was a great question because he's right there. And so I just got into it from there, and it just really sparked a passion I didn't even know that I had until I took the class, and I knew that's all I wanted to do. So if people can find that, it's pretty life-changing for sure.
Well, I appreciate this question so much. Like Sarah, I got into birds pretty late. my wife and I moved to Jefferson City from Columbia in 2012. And honestly, I had some trouble feeling at home there in our new house for a few years. She decided to buy me a bird feeder. And I filled it up, and then I sat there and watched, and in fly these chickadees. And I couldn't believe that there were actually birds coming to my feeder. It happened within minutes. And I just watched and watched, and more birds kept flying to the feeder and visiting the feeder. And wouldn't you know, it worked. I started to feel more connected to my home. I look out the next day, and there's a bird hopping around under the feeder, and I had no idea what it was. I pulled out this field guide. This was just 5 years ago. And I was able to identify the bird using a field guide. It was a brown thrasher. Every time that a new birder sees something they've never seen before, they think it's rare. And I thought, my God, I have a rare bird in my backyard. I have to tell everyone. Well, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, this escalated quickly. And I wanted to see everything that I possibly could, and I realized that if I actually left my yard, I could see more. Within a year, I met my close friends, Paul McKenzie and Brad Jacobs, and they became my mentors in that pursuit, local accomplished birders that I began to feel very close to. So that's the story in a nutshell. Thank you for asking.
I was just wondering, Noah, did you get an opportunity to see many raptors like the Philippine eagle or anything?
Don't get me started on the Philippine eagle. That was probably my biggest miss of the entire year, believe it or not. The Philippine eagle, for the uninitiated, is the world's largest raptor. It lives in the Philippines. It's the Philippines' national bird. It eats monkeys and small deer that it picks off from the rainforest. There's only a couple hundred of them left. It's critically endangered, and I really wanted to see one. And so I dedicated most of a day to sitting up on an overlook where you could see over a valley where Philippine eagles would soar on warm afternoons. Meanwhile, I have to average like 17 new birds a day to make it to my goal. You know, every hour the clock is ticking, but I really wanted to see this eagle, and we spent hours staking this spot out, and finally in the afternoon, several miles away, we could see a big raptor come up over the forest canopy and start circling. Flat wings, big profile. All the birders I was with were like, that's it. That's the Philippine eagle. And I'm looking through my binoculars, and it really honestly just looks like a dust speck in the distance. I couldn't see any color. I could only barely see the shape of this thing. And then it went down a couple minutes later, and we never saw it again. And I went to bed that night, and I just thought, there's no way I can count that on my list. I honestly have not seen a Philippine eagle, even if that was one, and they could identify it. So the Philippine eagle has yet to make it to my own life list, but one day I'll go back to the Philippines. Hopefully they'll stick around, and I'll get a chance to see one. But thank you for asking. That was a great question. Other raptors, yeah, well, it's just amazing going to different parts of the world and experiencing birds, especially in places you haven't really been before. So I had been to South and Central America quite a bit and worked on research projects and stuff, so I had a familiarity, at least a grasp of the bird life of those continents, but by the time I made it to like Africa and Asia, I really didn't. And I was learning as I went. It was a really good way to learn birds because rather than making these big jumps, I was gradually working from one place to the next. So every day I'd see a few new ones and then a bunch of overlapping birds that I'd been seeing the past few days that I could be refreshed on. So it wasn't ever really completely overwhelming. But yeah, the raptor that I did see in South America was the relative of the Philippine eagle, the harpy eagle. And we staked out a nest near the Pantanal in Brazil at dawn and waited for a few hours. And this time the harpy flew in and landed next to a nest with a half of a coati in its talons, like this raccoon-like tropical mammal, and they just ripped it to shreds on the branch right in front of us. There's like fur falling on us, and the female is on the nest, and it was just spectacular. So yes, I did have some very good raptor encounters as well throughout the year.
How many species are becoming extinct every year now?
Well, I feel like their eye contact is with me, so I'll take a stab, and anyone else can chime in. Probably not too many species are becoming extinct each year. Scientifically, we're describing many more birds right now than we're losing. That's just an artifact of DNA research on bird species. So the global list has been inflating at like 1% per year. We're gaining like 100 species a year for the global list, just in terms of how we define them. Mostly to this point, the extinctions have generally been limited to islands. The global extinction center of the world is the United States, because we have Hawaii and we have the territory of Guam. And both of those island areas have lost quite a few birds each. Just even in the past couple of decades, we've lost a couple of species there. And that continues, unfortunately, in Hawaii. There's various reasons for that. There are a couple of species that have gone extinct right here in the mainland of the US. You might have heard of the Carolina parakeet, the Bachman's warbler. There's a couple of others, the Labrador duck, going back in time, there's even more. But the bigger issue, I would say, in conservation right now is just the wholesale loss of bird populations overall. So there's this big study that just came out recently that said we've lost 3 billion birds in North America just since the 1970s. So while many of us, maybe not quite me, have been alive, like a third of all of our birds have disappeared. And that is much more worrying than the extinction of one species to me, because it means that our overall ecosystems are becoming degraded. And the line of us and everything that's related to us keeps going up, and the line of nature and everything related to nature keeps trending downward. I will just add one more slightly depressing, but I think fascinating factoid that I learned recently, which is that the global biomass of humans and our livestock now represents about 96% of all the biomass of all mammals on Earth. All the other wild mammals, all the whales, elephants, everything running around, falls into the other 4%. Birds are not quite that bad. It's about 60-30. So humans and our chickens, well, chickens, we're not birds, represent about 60% of all the avian biomass on Earth, if you throw in the domestic ducks and so on. And wild birds are, again, like the other 30. So that, to me, is pretty crazy. Shows that nature is not entirely limitless. And you guys can add more conservation comments if you wish.
Yeah, no, I would just add briefly that, yeah, we've lost 3 billion birds since 1970, and that's about 29% of birds in North America. And so those were like the greatest minds in ornithology, quantifying the net loss since 1970. So if you want to learn ways to help, and even in your daily life, there's things we can all do starting today that will really, really, really make a difference. It's just people have to do things differently at scale, like right now, just because birds are continuing to decline, not to be a total downer. But the website that came out with this article in the journal Science is 3billionbirds.org. It's the number 3, billionbirds.org, and it has 7 simple actions to help birds. And so these are things that at scale you can change in our own daily lives. It includes a number of things. So I would encourage you to check it out.
Can I jump back in and add one really inspiring thing I saw right here today? I went out to one of our local golf courses in Columbia, and for the past 10 years, they've had a program to grow native habitat all over the golf course. I don't know if you've all seen this. I was blown away. They had these wildflower stands and pollinator areas that were pretty big, like acres in size, all along the golf course, just in places where golf balls aren't supposed to land. And they're maintaining those. And I got the tour. I got to drive a golf cart around there today and look at them all, and the bluebird trails they have put up along the course and everything. And it was just full of birds. All of those areas that they've planted in flowers and seeds this time of year, they were just bursting with goldfinches and warblers and sparrows and woodpeckers and chickadees and titmice and everything you can imagine. Whereas before, there was just lawn. So one of those really simple actions you can do, as we were talking about earlier, is just dedicate a portion of your yard, which might be lawn, and grow up a pollinator garden. It doesn't even have to be that big to provide a refuge to a migrating sparrow or a warbler that might like to drop in.
Which species are most in decline in Missouri currently within this year?
What a great question. So we wrote the Missouri Bird Conservation Plan in 2019. It's not a Missouri Department of Conservation plan. It's a Missouri plan. We wrote it with a bunch of conservation partners, and it provides a reference for the state's most threatened bird species that are declining, what you can do to manage habitat for them if you own acreage. We assigned them a Missouri Concern Score. We outline research and monitoring needs that have to happen in the state. And so that's available on our website, on the Missouri Department of Conservation website. But yeah, it outlines our most threatened species and what you can do to help them. So if any of you own acreage or know people that do own acreage, it's like a 40-page plan. So it's not a super dry, terrible plan. It is called the technical section of the bird plan, but still. We wrote it to be accessible and for people who don't know anything about conservation, with a good introduction about how birds are declining and how important this is. And so, yeah, it's available on our website in a PDF if anyone is interested.
I think we have time for one more question.
Can I ask Noah a question?
Sure.
What was the most inspiring conservation story you encountered on your trip other than the Angel of Peace?
Oh, man. What is the most inspiring conservation story I encountered anywhere in the world other than Angel Paz? It's honestly hard to single one out. I feel like the most inspiring ones to me were along the same lines, where it was local people in charge of conserving the habitats right around the areas that they lived and they knew. I also saw many examples of international conservation groups coming in, buying up land, and then telling all the local people you can't go in there anymore. And that created all kinds of hostility and conflict just over and over in places that I traveled to. Whereas if the local people were involved, even if an international group had come in and worked with them on this project, rather than just buying the land and kicking them off it, I think those projects probably had a greater success rate long term, because they're really invested and they know why it's important and they're proud of what they're doing. So I don't want to single anyone out because I saw that actually happening in quite a few places. I think it is very depressing in some ways to go around the world in like this blink of an eye in 1 year and see the state of the world's birds right now and realize how many troubles they're facing in different places. But I also found it very inspiring to feel like never before have so many people cared about birds for many different reasons. I think the internet, as I mentioned, has brought people together. The optic technology of binoculars has gotten good and cheap enough that it's accessible to people even who are not, first world and wealthy. Field guides are now in print for almost every country and sub-region in the world, which was not true even just a couple of decades ago. And they're now being translated into all of the local languages, and they're being brought out in app form so people on their cell phones can download them and get involved. And all of those things are bringing nature and birds specifically closer to people and making them real. And it's said so often that it's become a cliche, but once people start caring about them, then they are more apt to get involved in conservation in their local areas and protect them. So yeah, it's a weird moment in conservation history where never before have so many birds faced an uncertain future, but also never before have so many people cared about them.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to do the last two raffle prizes, the drawings right now. So Noah, if you can help us. We got a few last minute entries too.
Mixing in progress. All right, I'm gonna reach in here. I'm not going for the strategically folded one or the one on the top. Linda Krowr, known, Krowr, Kaowr, plus or minus 2 letters. Okay, she will be contacted. And number 2.
This is for the gift basket out front.
This is for the gift basket out front. Okay, we've got William Velema. William Velema. Well, he's got an email address on there as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Before we wrap up, we have some little goodie bags here for each of our speakers. Of course, the person that traveled the furthest is going to get the biggest one because he probably has lots of room in his luggage.
Can I fit this in my carry-on? Oh my gosh. Can I open it now?
Sure.
Oh man, I don't know. I can't get the ribbon off. I'm just going to peek in here. Oh, I'm going to put this on my new Prius I just inherited. This sticker says BRDR.
Yes.
Because for years my license plate had says BRD space BOY. So it'll go very well with my license plate. Although the R on the license plate kind of looks like an A, so people always think it says bad boy. You think I should graduate to Birdman? No, if the Spice Girls can stay young forever and the Beach Boys, then so can Bird Boy. Okay, I've got a mug with some chocolates in it, and it has Columbia Audubon Society on it. Very good. And I've got a hat in here, and some cards, and a notebook, and a butterfly chocolate. Oh my gosh. Can I take the notebook out?
Yeah.
Are you talking about this one? Paper. I don't know. It's made of handmade recycled paper, according to the label on the back, but it's handcrafted. Oh, I didn't read far enough. With a mixture of elephant waste and post-consumer paper. This is an elephant dung notebook in the shape of a penguin. Oh my gosh, this is the best ever. I'm going to use this. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're all getting kind of rummy. I'd like to thank a few folks before we all leave. Our sponsors, Dr. Rosenfeld especially, the Columbia Audubon Society, Missouri Birding Society, MU School of Natural Resources, eBird, Songbird Station, Bird's Eye View, Mr. Bill Rupert, the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and their Grow Native program. If you're interested in what plants to plant, the folks at Grow Native can help, and you can go to it online. And then also 3 of my counterparts that have worked tirelessly on the whole event tonight, Donna Paleo, Jan Wiesfales, and Nancy Bedan. Thank you all. Okay, I think we're done here. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I think we're going to have Noah go out in the lobby for anybody that wants to have a book signed. I don't know if you got the elephant dung notebook, but
My friend after grad school went